She ruled an empire draped in silk and shadows, crowned herself emperor in a world of men, and was nearly erased from history. Tonight, we uncover the story of Empress Irene of Byzantium, a woman of fierce ambition, quiet power, and dangerous beauty. From palace intrigues to whispered betrayals, her reign was both brilliant and brutal. And yet, time chose to forget her. Until now, if lost voices and hidden reigns help you drift into calm, you're right where you belong. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to explore more forgotten thrones, silent victories, and the women history tried to leave behind, one soft-spoken story at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. In the middle of the 8th century, when the Byzantine Empire, what remained of the once mighty Roman state, struggled to maintain its position against external threat and internal tensions, a young girl was born into a noble family in Athens. Her name was Irene Sarantapachina, and few could have predicted that this child, born around the year 752 CE in a city that had long since lost its ancient glory, would one day become the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right. Athens, in the 8th century, was but a shadow of its classical splendor. Once the heart of philosophy, democracy, and artistic achievement in the ancient world, by Irene's time, it had become a provincial backwater in the Byzantine Empire. The Parthenon still stood on the Acropolis, though it had been converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The streets where Socrates and Plato once walked were now traversed by Byzantine officials, Orthodox priests, and local merchants, all living under the distant authority of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire itself was in a state of transformation. Having lost much of its territory to the expanding Arab Caliphate in the 7th century, including Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, the empire had contracted to encompass primarily Asia Minor, modern Turkey, the southern Balkans, parts of Italy, and scattered islands in the Mediterranean. The capital of Constantinople, however, remained one of the world's greatest cities, a bastion of Christian civilization with its magnificent churches, palaces, and fortified walls that had thus far repelled all attackers. Irene's family, while noble, was not among the highest echelons of Byzantine aristocracy. The Sarantapechos family was of Greek origin and held influence in Athens and its surroundings, but they were provincial nobility rather than members of the imperial court. Of Irene's early life, little is known with certainty. Like most noble girls of her time, she would have received some education, learning to read and write Greek, studying religious texts, and acquiring the skills necessary for managing a household. She would have been raised in the Orthodox Christian faith, which permeated every aspect of Byzantine society and culture. The path that would lead this provincial noblewoman to the imperial throne began with a most unusual event, a bride show. In 768 CE, when Irene was approximately 16 years old, she was selected to participate in a bride show organized by the Byzantine Empress Eudokia, wife of Emperor Constantine V. Bride shows were a peculiar Byzantine custom in which eligible young noblewomen from across the empire were summoned to Constantinople to be evaluated as potential brides for imperial princes. These events combined elements of a beauty pageant, a test of character and intelligence, and a political negotiation as families sought to advance their interests through advantageous marriages. The particular bride show in which Irene participated was intended to find a suitable wife for Leo, the son of Emperor Constantine V, and his heir apparent. Constantine V was a powerful ruler who had strengthened the empire militarily and economically, but he was also a staunch iconoclast, a supporter of the theological position that religious images or icons were a form of idolatry and should be destroyed. The iconoclast controversy had divided Byzantine society, with many monasteries and conservative elements of the church opposing the imperial policy of icon destruction. When Irene arrived in Constantinople to participate in the bride show, she entered a world vastly different from provincial Athens. The great palace complex stretched over a vast area along the shore of the Bosporus, comprising numerous buildings, courtyards, gardens, and chapels, interconnected in a labyrinth of imperial splendor. Gold mosaics glittered on ceilings, silk tapestries adorned walls, and fountains burbled in marble-paved courtyards. Court officials in elaborate silk robes moved through the palace according to strict protocols of precedence, while eunuchs, castrated men who served as trusted imperial servants, managed the daily operations of the imperial household. How exactly Irene distinguished herself from the other candidates at the bride show remains unclear, but she was ultimately selected to marry Leo, the son of Constantine V. This selection is particularly interesting because Irene came from a family known to be sympathetic to the veneration of icons, while the imperial family was staunchly iconoclast. Perhaps her beauty was exceptional, or maybe her intelligence impressed the imperial family. Some historians have suggested that her selection might have been intended as a political move to reconcile the iconoclast court with the icon-venerating segments of Byzantine society. The marriage of Irene and Leo took place in December 769 CE. As was customary for imperial brides, Irene had to change her name upon entering the imperial family. She was given the name Irene of Athens, emphasizing her origin while integrating her into the imperial lineage. The wedding would have been a spectacular affair, celebrated with all the pomp and ceremony that the Byzantine court could muster. The young bride would have been adorned in costly garments of silk embroidered with gold thread, perhaps wearing the distinctive prependolia, jeweled ornaments that hung from her crown alongside her face, that became fashionable for Byzantine empresses during this period. After the wedding, Irene's life was transformed completely. She now resided in the women's quarters of the Great Palace, an area known as the gynaeconitis, where imperial women lived with their attendants under the supervision of eunuchs. The gynaeconitis was a world unto itself, with its own hierarchies, customs, and daily routines. The new bride had to learn the intricate etiquette of court life, where every gesture, word, and article of clothing carried significance and could convey subtle political messages. As the wife of the heir apparent, Irene held the title of nobilissima, placing her high in the court hierarchy but still subordinate to her mother-in-law, Empress Eudokia. Her primary duty, as with all imperial women, was to produce a male heir who would continue the imperial bloodline. In this, she was successful relatively quickly. On January 14, 771 CE, Irene gave birth to a son who was named Constantine after his grandfather. The birth of a healthy male heir strengthened Irene's position at court and ensured, at least temporarily, her security within the imperial family. The joy of motherhood, however, was soon followed by tragedy. In August 775 CE, Emperor Constantine V died while on campaign against the Bulgarians. Leo, Irene's husband, ascended the throne as Leo IV, making Irene the Empress consort of the Byzantine Empire. The imperial coronation ceremony, held in the magnificent Hagia Sophia Cathedral, would have been one of extraordinary splendor. Irene would have been crowned with a stemma, an imperial crown, and adorned with imperial regalia, marking her new status as Augusta, the highest title for an imperial woman. As you consider the young empress from Athens now established in the most magnificent court in Christendom, you might wonder, how did this woman, raised in a provincial environment far from the center of power, adapt to the intricate protocols and dangerous politics of the imperial court. What thoughts ran through her mind as she watched her husband conduct the business of empire? Did she already harbor ambitions beyond those traditionally allowed to a Byzantine empress? And how did her iconophile sympathies influence her actions in an officially iconoclast court? In the complex world of Byzantine politics, where religious controversy intertwined with questions of imperial authority, Irene's position was precarious yet pregnant with possibility. The stage was being set for a dramatic turn of events that would test her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics and ultimately transform her from a conventional empress consort into something Byzantine society had never seen before: a woman ruling in her own right. The relative stability that marked the early years of Leo IV's reign was not destined to last. Though the young emperor had ascended the throne with considerable popular support, his health had always been fragile, a fact that would soon prove consequential for the empire, and for Irene in particular. The daily administration of such a vast state placed considerable strain on Leo, who lacked the robust constitution of his warrior father, Constantine IV. The imperial court during this period operated within the magnificent Great Palace complex, a sprawling collection of buildings, gardens, and ceremonial spaces that had grown organically since the time of Constantine the Great in the 4th century. By the 8th century, the palace had become a city within a city, with its own water supply, baths, churches, and administrative buildings. The main ceremonial spaces included the Chrysotriklinos, or Golden Hall, an octagonal throne room where the emperor received foreign ambassadors and conducted important state business. Nearby stood the Magnora Palace, used for formal receptions, and the Daphne Palace, the main residential section where the imperial family lived. Life within these palatial surroundings followed an elaborate routine governed by strict protocol. The Book of Ceremonies, later compiled under Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, gives us a glimpse into the intricate rituals that structured each day. The emperor would rise early and attend prayers in one of the palace chapels, such as the Church of the Lord or the Church of the Theotokos of the Pharaohs, which housed precious relics, including what was believed to be a piece of the true cross. After morning devotions, Leo would meet with his ministers in the Chrysotriklinos, seated on the elevated golden throne that symbolized his divine authority. Empress Irene, meanwhile, had her own duties and sphere of influence. The Gynaeconitis, or women's quarters, was her domain, where she oversaw a staff of female attendants and eunuchs. On ceremonial occasions, she would appear alongside her husband, dressed in resplendent garments that befitted her station. An empress's clothing was not merely decorative, but deeply symbolic, with purple silk and gold embroidery reserved exclusively for the imperial family. Irene's crown, or stemma, would have been adorned with pearls and precious stones, indicating her exalted status. Beyond the ceremonial aspects of her role, Irene was developing a reputation for intelligence and political acumen. The emperor's deteriorating health meant that she was increasingly called upon to help manage court affairs, though always carefully maintaining the appearance of proper submission to her husband's authority. Byzantine society maintained strict gender roles, with women typically excluded from formal positions of power. However, throughout Byzantine history, empresses had often exercised significant influence behind the scenes, particularly those who were mothers of young heirs to the throne. By the year 778 CE, 3 years into Leo's reign, tensions were emerging around the issue of religious icons. Though Leo IV was less zealous than his father in persecuting those who venerated religious images, he maintained the official iconoclast position that had been imperial policy since Emperor Leo III issued his edict against icons in 730 CE. The iconoclast controversy was not merely a theological dispute. It had profound political implications, touching on the limits of imperial authority in religious matters and the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the papacy in Rome, which strongly opposed iconoclasm. Evidence suggests that Irene maintained her personal devotion to icons throughout these years, though she would have had to practice her faith discreetly. The palace contained numerous hidden spaces where private devotions could occur away from public scrutiny. Byzantine palaces were designed with complex networks of corridors, antechambers, and secret passages that allowed for movement throughout the complex while maintaining appropriate separations between different groups. It is not difficult to imagine Irene maintaining a small private oratory where she could venerate icons away from the official iconoclast gaze. The question of Irene's religious sympathies became more than a personal matter when, in 778 CE, Leo discovered icons hidden among her possessions. This discovery, recorded by the chronicler Theophanes, provoked the emperor's anger and temporarily damaged Irene's position at court. According to Theophanes, Leo excluded her from his company and had no marital relations with her. This incident reveals not only Irene's personal commitment to icon veneration, but also the political risk she was willing to take by maintaining her religious convictions contrary to official imperial policy. Despite this temporary disgrace, Irene was not removed from court, suggesting that Leo's affection for her, or perhaps his recognition of her political usefulness, outweighed his anger at her religious disobedience. The incident also highlights the complex interplay between personal belief and political expediency that characterized Byzantine court life. While Leo publicly maintained the iconoclast position that he had inherited from his father, his response to discovering Irene's icons was relatively mild compared to the harsh persecutions that had occurred under Constantine V. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, the empire faced ongoing external challenges. The Arab Caliphate continued to exert pressure on the eastern frontiers, with periodic raids into Byzantine territory in Asia Minor. To the north, the Bulgars represented a persistent threat, requiring constant diplomatic and military attention. Leo IV, lacking his father's military prowess, relied heavily on experienced generals and diplomats to manage these external threats. In the summer of 780 CE, the emperor's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. The exact nature of his illness is unclear from the sources, though some historians have suggested that he may have suffered from tuberculosis or a similar wasting disease. What is clear is that by September of that year, it had become evident that the young emperor was dying. On September 8, 780 CE, Leo IV passed away at the age of just 30. He had ruled for only 5 years. The death of an emperor was always a moment of potential crisis in Byzantium, a time when court factions might struggle for power and when external enemies might seek to take advantage of perceived weakness. In this case, the situation was particularly precarious because the legitimate heir to the throne, Constantine VI, was only 9 years old. Byzantine law provided no formal framework for a regency government, though there were precedents for empresses acting as regents for underage sons. Immediately upon Leo's death, Irene moved decisively to secure her position and that of her son. The young Constantine VI was proclaimed sole emperor, with Irene acting as regent during his minority. This arrangement was formally recognized in an elaborate ceremony at the Hagia Sophia, where both mother and son were acclaimed by the army, the Senate, and representatives of the people. Irene required all officials to swear an oath of loyalty to both her son and herself, a significant departure from normal practice that foreshadowed her determination to exercise real power rather than merely nominal regency authority. The transition was not entirely smooth. Leo's 5 brothers, led by the Caesar Nikephoros, initially opposed Irene's regency, preferring a male-dominated council to govern during Constantine's minority. The chronicles record that this opposition was swiftly suppressed. Irene, demonstrating the political ruthlessness that would characterize her rule, had her brothers-in-law ordained as priests and confined to monasteries, effectively removing them from the political arena. Byzantine political culture viewed the tonsuring of potential rivals as a humane alternative to execution or blinding, as men who had taken holy orders were considered ineligible for imperial office. With her position as regent secured, Irene began to assemble a government of trusted officials who would help her rule the empire. Among her most important allies were the eunuchs of the palace, particularly the eunuch Staurakios, who became her chief minister and closest advisor. Eunuchs, castrated men who typically entered imperial service as children, played a vital role in Byzantine court politics because they could not establish dynasties of their own. They were considered more reliable servants of the imperial family. They often served as intermediaries between the women's quarters and the male-dominated spheres of government, making them natural allies for an empress regent. The first years of Irene's regency were marked by careful consolidation of power. She maintained the general structure of government that had existed under her husband and father-in-law, working through the established bureaucracy while gradually placing her own supporters in key positions. The Byzantine administrative system was remarkably sophisticated for its time, with specialized departments handling different aspects of governance, from the public post to tax collection to military logistics. At the apex of this bureaucracy stood the imperial cabinet, consisting of the highest officials of state. These included the logothete of the drome, responsible for communications and foreign affairs, the sacellarios, who oversaw the treasury, the quaestor, who handled legal matters, and various military commanders. By carefully selecting loyal individuals for these positions, Irene gradually established control over the machinery of government. In foreign affairs, Irene initially adopted a cautious approach. The empire's resources had been strained by the military campaigns of Constantine V and Leo IV, and Irene recognized the need for a period of consolidation. She negotiated a 3-year truce with the Abbasid Caliphate, agreeing to pay an annual tribute in exchange for peace on the eastern frontier. This arrangement, while perhaps not ideal from a perspective of imperial pride, provided breathing room for the new regime to establish itself. Relations with the Bulgars proved more challenging. In 780 CE, the same year that Irene assumed the regency, the Bulgar Khan Kardam came to power and adopted an aggressive stance toward Byzantium. Irene responded by strengthening the empire's defenses in Thrace and Macedonia and by attempting to cultivate diplomatic ties with Frankish rulers to the west, seeking to isolate the Bulgars diplomatically. It was in the realm of religious policy, however, that Irene's regency would prove most consequential. From the beginning, it was clear that she intended to reverse the iconoclast policies that had been in place since 730 CE. This was a bold and potentially risky move. Iconoclasm had become deeply entrenched in the military and in significant segments of the aristocracy during the 50 years of its official status. The army, in particular, had been shaped by Constantine V, a successful general who had infused his troops with iconoclast fervor. Irene proceeded cautiously but deliberately. Her first step was to signal a change in official attitudes by allowing individuals who had been exiled for icon veneration to return to Constantinople. Among these were many monks who had suffered under the persecutions of Constantine V, including figures such as Plato of Sacudian, who would become important allies in Irene's religious policies. Next, Irene moved to reshape the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Paul IV, had been appointed under Leo IV and maintained the official iconoclast position. In 784 CE, after 4 years in office, Paul resigned his position, citing ill health but also expressing remorse for his role in the iconoclast policies. Whether this resignation was entirely voluntary or encouraged by Irene's administration remains uncertain, but it created an opportunity for the regent to appoint a patriarch more aligned with her religious views. The man Irene selected was Tarasios, who had been serving as her principal secretary, Asicrates. Though a layman at the time of his selection, a fact that caused some controversy, Tarasios was rapidly advanced through the ecclesiastical ranks and installed as Patriarch of Constantinople. He was known to share Irene's views on the legitimacy of icon veneration, making him an ideal partner in her planned religious reforms. With a sympathetic patriarch in place, Irene moved forward with plans to convene an ecumenical council that would formally reverse the iconoclast position. This was a significant undertaking that required careful preparation, both theologically and politically. Ecumenical councils were the highest authority in the Orthodox Church, with the power to define doctrine and condemn heresy. 6 previous councils had been held, addressing various theological controversies, but none had dealt with the question of icons. The first attempt to convene the council in 786 CE ended in failure when troops loyal to the iconoclast position disrupted the proceedings. This incident highlighted the continuing strength of iconoclast sentiment in the army and the potential danger it posed to Irene's religious reforms. Recognizing the seriousness of this threat, Irene took decisive action. She disbanded the problematic military units and reorganized the army, placing trusted officers in key positions. With these precautions in place, a second attempt to convene the council was made in 787 CE. This time, the location was moved from Constantinople to Nicaea in Bithynia, the site of the First Ecumenical Council in 325 CE, which had established the Nicene Creed. The choice of location was symbolically significant, linking the new council to the foundational council of Orthodox Christianity. The Second Council of Nicaea, as it came to be known, convened on September 24, 787 CE, with approximately 350 bishops in attendance. Representatives from Rome, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch participated, giving the council the ecumenical character necessary for its decisions to be considered binding on the entire Church. Irene herself did not attend the main sessions of the council, as it would have been inappropriate for a woman to participate directly in ecclesiastical deliberations, but she and young Constantine were present for the final ceremonial session, held in Constantinople. The deliberations of the council lasted for a month, during which the theological basis for icon veneration was carefully established. The council drew on the writings of church fathers and earlier traditions to argue that icons were not idols, but rather windows to the divine, worthy of veneration, proskinesis, though not worship, latria, which was reserved for God alone. On October 23, 787 CE, the council issued its final decree, restoring icon veneration as an orthodox practice and condemning iconoclasm as heresy. This was a momentous achievement for Irene. In one stroke, she had reversed 50 years of imperial religious policy and aligned the Byzantine Church with Rome and the other ancient patriarchates. The political significance of this religious shift cannot be overstated. By championing orthodox icon veneration, Irene positioned herself as a defender of tradition against what could now be characterized as the heretical innovations of her iconoclast predecessors. The return to icon veneration was celebrated throughout the empire by those who had maintained their devotion to images despite official persecution. Churches that had been stripped of their decorations began to be adorned once again with the sacred images that played such an important role in Orthodox spiritual practice. Monks who had been among the most steadfast opponents of iconoclasm returned to their monasteries and resumed their traditional roles as spiritual advisors and copyists of religious texts. As the 780s progressed, Irene's position as regent appeared increasingly secure. She had successfully navigated the dangerous waters of the regency's early years, suppressed potential rivals, established control over the bureaucracy, and implemented a major religious reform that strengthened her support among key segments of Byzantine society. Yet challenges remained. The young Constantine was growing older, and questions about when he would assume his rightful place as sole emperor were beginning to emerge. How would Irene, who had clearly developed a taste for real power, handle the eventual transition? And what of the ongoing threats from Bulgars, Arabs, and other external enemies? As the decade drew to a close, these questions hung in the air, foreshadowing the complex dynamics that would characterize the next phase of Irene's remarkable career. By the mid-780s, Empress Irene had firmly established herself as the power behind the imperial throne. Her son Constantine VI, now approaching his teenage years, remained emperor in name, but the reins of government were held firmly in his mother's capable hands. This arrangement, while unusual, was not unprecedented in Byzantine history. Previous empresses had served as regents for underage sons, though few had exercised power as decisively as Irene. The relationship between mother and son during these years reveals much about both Irene's character and the nature of Byzantine court politics. Constantine received the education typical for an imperial heir, studying with tutors who instructed him in subjects ranging from rhetoric and philosophy to military strategy and statecraft. He was also taught the elaborate ceremonial that governed court life, preparing him for the highly ritualized role he would eventually assume. Yet there are indications that Irene deliberately kept her son somewhat isolated from the practical business of government, perhaps to delay the moment when he would be prepared to rule independently. This period of Irene's regency coincided with significant developments beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire. To the west, the Frankish kingdom was experiencing a remarkable expansion of power under Charlemagne, who had become king in 768 CE. By the 780s, Charlemagne had conquered Lombardy in northern Italy, bringing him into closer proximity with Byzantine territories in southern Italy and creating both potential for conflict and for alliance. Recognizing the growing importance of the Frankish kingdom, Irene initiated diplomatic contacts with Charlemagne. In 781 CE, a betrothal was arranged between Constantine VI, then 10 years old, and Rotrude, Charlemagne's daughter. This proposed marriage alliance would have created a powerful bond between the two most significant Christian powers of the era. Byzantine diplomacy typically used marriage alliances as tools of statecraft, though marriages to barbarian rulers or their relatives were somewhat unusual. To prepare for the eventual marriage, a Frankish teacher was sent to Constantinople to instruct Rotrude in Greek language and Byzantine customs. Meanwhile, a Byzantine tutor was assigned to teach Constantine the Latin language, suggesting that the planned marriage was taken seriously by both courts. This diplomatic initiative represents one of Irene's more forward-thinking foreign policy achievements, though as we shall see, the betrothal would ultimately not lead to marriage. The restoration of icon veneration following the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE had profound cultural as well as religious implications. The 50 years of iconoclasm had created a significant rupture in Byzantine artistic traditions, with many works destroyed and artistic skills lost. With icons once again accepted as orthodox, there was a flourishing of religious art as churches and monasteries commissioned new works to replace those that had been destroyed. The iconography that emerged in this period showed both continuity with pre-iconoclast traditions and subtle innovations. Byzantine religious art was highly conventional, with specific rules governing how saints and biblical scenes should be depicted. The post-iconoclast period saw a gradual return to these conventions, though with an increased emphasis on the humanity of Christ and the saints, perhaps in reaction to the iconoclast argument that divinity could not be depicted in material form. Irene's patronage of religious art extended beyond mere permission for icons to be created. She commissioned works for churches and monasteries, demonstrating her personal commitment to the orthodox position she had fought to restore. Among the most significant artistic projects of her regency was the restoration of the Church of the Virgin of the Source, Theotokos Pege, outside Constantinople, which had fallen into disrepair during the iconoclast period. The church was renowned for its healing spring and became an important pilgrimage site after its restoration. Architecture also flourished under Irene's patronage. Byzantine church architecture had developed distinctive features including the central dome, the Greek cross plan, and the use of pendentives to support the dome over a square base. Churches built or restored during Irene's regency continued these traditions while also incorporating rich decorative elements like marble revetments and mosaic decoration that had been somewhat simplified during the iconoclast era. The intellectual life of Byzantium also experienced a modest revival during this period. The iconoclast controversy had stimulated theological debate, and the return to orthodoxy was accompanied by renewed scholarly activity, particularly in monasteries. The copying of ancient texts, both religious and secular, was an important activity of Byzantine monks, and this work expanded under Irene's rule. The Studion monastery in Constantinople, which had been a center of opposition to iconoclasm, became particularly important as a center of intellectual and spiritual life. Daily life for ordinary Byzantines during Irene's regency continued much as it had for centuries. The empire was predominantly agricultural, with the majority of the population living in rural villages and working the land. A typical Byzantine peasant family would live in a simple stone or mud brick dwelling, perhaps with 1 or 2 rooms, and would farm a small plot of land, growing grain, olives and grapes, and keeping a few animals. Urban life was more varied, with cities serving as administrative centers, markets, and hubs of craft production. Constantinople, with its estimated population of 300,000 to 400,000, was by far the largest city in the empire and indeed in all of Christian Europe. Its residents enjoyed amenities including a complex water supply system, public baths, and the hippodrome, where chariot races and other public entertainments were held. Trade remained vital to the Byzantine economy, though it had contracted somewhat from its peak in the 6th century. Constantinople's strategic location on the Bosporus made it a natural trading hub, and markets in the city offered goods from across the known world. Byzantine gold coins, the solidus, numisma, were renowned for their purity and served as an international currency, facilitating commerce throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. As Constantine VI approached adulthood, the question of his marriage became increasingly pressing. The betrothal to Charlemagne's daughter Rotrud, arranged in 781 CE, had continued in force throughout the early years of Irene's regency. However, in 788 CE, Irene suddenly broke off this engagement. The reasons for this diplomatic reversal are not entirely clear from the sources. Some historians have suggested that Irene had become concerned about Charlemagne's growing power in Italy and wanted to distance Byzantium from the Frankish ruler. Others have proposed that she feared a Frankish wife might encourage Constantine to assert his independence from his mother's control. Whatever the motivation, Irene's decision to end the betrothal to Rotrud represents a significant shift in Byzantine foreign policy and raises questions about Irene's long-term intentions for her son's rule. Instead of the Frankish princess, Irene selected a local woman named Maria of Amnia as Constantine's bride. Maria came from an undistinguished family with no independent power base, making her less likely to encourage Constantine toward independence. The marriage took place in November 788 CE, when Constantine was 17 years old. By this time, Constantine had reached an age at which he could reasonably be expected to begin taking a more active role in government. Byzantine tradition did not specify an exact age of majority for emperors, but 17 would certainly have been old enough for Constantine to start assuming imperial responsibilities. Yet Irene showed little inclination to hand over power to her son, She continued to dominate government, making decisions and issuing orders in her own name as well as Constantine's. This situation created growing tension at court. Constantine, now a married man approaching adulthood, naturally sought a greater role in the empire he was nominally ruling. A faction began to form around the young emperor, consisting of officials and military leaders who either believed in the principle of male imperial rule or simply sought to advance their careers by attaching themselves to the emperor rather than his regent mother. Matters came to a head in 790 CE when a group of military officials attempted to proclaim Constantine as sole ruler without Irene's regency. The plot was discovered before it could be fully implemented, and Irene moved swiftly to punish those involved. The leaders of the conspiracy were exiled, and Constantine himself was disciplined, though not harmed. Irene went so far as to demand that the army renew its oath of loyalty, swearing allegiance to her first and to Constantine second, a clear indication of her determination to maintain her position. This attempt to sideline Constantine, however, proved to be a miscalculation on Irene's part. The Armenian regiment of the imperial army, stationed in Constantinople, refused to accept this reversal of the natural order. In their view, Constantine was now old enough to rule, and continuing to subordinate him to his mother was improper. In October 790 CE, they rose in revolt, demanding that Constantine be recognized as sole emperor. Faced with military opposition, Irene was forced to yield. Constantine VI, now 19 years old, assumed full imperial power while Irene was relegated to a secondary position. She retained the title of Empress but was removed from active participation in government. Some sources suggest that she was briefly exiled to one of the imperial palaces outside Constantinople, though this exile, if it occurred, was short-lived. Constantine's independent rule, however, proved to be problematic. Though he had received an imperial education, his practical experience in governance was limited due to Irene's domination of affairs during his adolescence. He lacked the political skills necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of Byzantine court politics, and he struggled to command the respect of experienced officials who had served under his mother. In military matters, Constantine showed more promise. In 791 CE, he led a campaign against the Bulgars, though it achieved little concrete success. The following year, he campaigned against the Arabs in Asia Minor with somewhat better results. These military activities were important not only for the defense of the empire but also for establishing Constantine's authority. Byzantine emperors were expected to lead armies in person, and military success was a crucial component of imperial prestige. Despite these efforts, Constantine's position remained precarious. By 792 CE, dissatisfaction with his rule had grown to the point where a plot was formed to replace him with his uncle Nikephoros, one of Leo Thorne's brothers who had been ordained as priests early in Irene's regency. The conspiracy was discovered, and Constantine responded with harsh punishments. Nikephoros was blinded, and his 4 brothers had their tongues cut out, ensuring they could never serve as figureheads for future rebellions. These mutilations, while cruel by modern standards, were considered relatively humane in Byzantine political practice. Blinding in particular was a common fate for deposed emperors or dangerous rivals, as it rendered them ineligible for the throne, the emperor being considered God's representative on earth, and therefore required to be physically perfect without the moral stain of execution. Following the suppression of this plot, Constantine took the surprising step of recalling his mother to court and restoring her to a position of influence. The precise motivation for this reconciliation is unclear. Perhaps Constantine recognized his own limitations and valued his mother's political experience, or perhaps he sought to reconcile competing factions at court. Whatever the reason, by early 792 CE, Irene had returned to a position of shared power, with official documents once again naming both Constantine and Irene as rulers. This power-sharing arrangement persisted for the next 5 years, though the balance of authority between mother and son fluctuated. Constantine continued to lead military campaigns and to make appointments to high office, while Irene maintained significant influence, particularly in matters of court ceremony and religious policy. The relationship between them appears to have been one of uneasy cooperation rather than genuine reconciliation, with each maintaining their own supporters and pursuing sometimes divergent agendas. One area where Constantine departed from his mother's policies was in relations with the Franks. Where Irene had broken the betrothal with Charlemagne's daughter and generally maintained a cautious distance from Frankish power, Constantine sought to improve relations. This diplomatic opening might have led to a significant realignment of power in the Christian world, but events in Constantine's personal life would soon create a crisis that would overshadow all other considerations. By 795 CE, Constantine's marriage to Maria of Amnia had produced a daughter but no sons, creating anxiety about the continuation of the dynasty. Moreover, Constantine had fallen in love with a court lady named Theodote, a cousin of the famous abbot Theodore of Studium. Constantine determined to divorce Maria and marry Theodote, a decision that would have profound consequences for his reign and for his relationship with his mother. Divorce and remarriage, while permitted under Byzantine civil law under certain circumstances, were viewed with disapproval by the Church, particularly when not justified by serious offences such as adultery. Constantine's desire to divorce Maria solely because he had fallen in love with another woman and wanted a male heir was considered insufficient grounds by church authorities. Nevertheless, Constantine pressed forward with his plan, forcing Maria to enter a convent, a common fate for discarded imperial wives, and proceeding with preparations to marry Theodote. This action placed the recently restored Patriarch Tarasios in a difficult position. As the highest religious authority in the empire, he was expected to uphold church teaching on marriage. Yet, as an imperial appointee who owed his position to the imperial family, he was reluctant to directly oppose the emperor's will. Tarasios chose a middle path. He refused to perform the marriage himself, but did not actively prevent it, allowing a priest named Joseph to conduct the ceremony in August 795 CE. The emperor's divorce and remarriage provoked a serious religious controversy. The monastic community, in particular, was outraged by what they saw as a clear violation of Christian teaching. Theodore of Studium, whose monastery had become a center of strict Orthodox observance, emerged as a leading critic of the emperor's actions. He not only condemned Constantine's divorce, but also criticized Patriarch Tarasios for failing to take a stronger stand against it. This controversy, which came to be known as the Mokian controversy, from the Greek moicheia, meaning adultery, created a significant rift in Byzantine society. The monks of the Studion monastery and their supporters refused to recognize Constantine's new marriage or to remain in communion with the clergy who had sanctioned it. The emperor responded with persecutions, exiling Theodore and other outspoken critics to distant provinces. Irene's position in this controversy is significant. Though she had been reconciled with her son and shared power with him, the sources indicate that she opposed his divorce and remarriage. This opposition was likely motivated by a combination of genuine religious conviction and political calculation. The controversy had weakened Constantine's standing with important segments of Byzantine society, particularly the influential monastic community, creating an opportunity for Irene to gather support for a potential return to power. By 797 CE, the situation had reached a critical point. Constantine's position had been weakened by the marriage controversy, by military setbacks in campaigns against the Bulgars, and by his own political missteps. Irene, sensing her opportunity, began to plot her son's overthrow. She assembled a group of conspirators, including the eunuch Aetios, and other palace officials who had remained loyal to her. The conspiracy came to fruition in August 797 CE. According to the chronicler Theophanes, Constantine was seized by his mother's supporters in the hippodrome, where he was attending the horse races. He was brought to the porphyra chamber of the Great Palace, the purple-decorated room where emperors were traditionally born and where Constantine himself had been delivered. And there, on August 15, 797 CE, he was blinded. The blinding of Constantine VI stands as one of the most shocking episodes in Byzantine history. For a mother to order such a punishment for her own son violated fundamental norms of both family relations and political conduct. The fact that the blinding took place in the porphyra chamber, a space associated with imperial birth and legitimacy, added a layer of symbolic horror to the physical act of mutilation. With Constantine incapacitated by blindness and isolated from potential supporters, Irene was able to assume full imperial power. She now ruled not as regent for her son, but as emperor in her own right, the first woman to do so in Byzantine history. On her coins and in official documents, she adopted the title Basileus, the masculine form meaning emperor, rather than Basilissa, the feminine form meaning empress. This linguistic choice emphasized that she was claiming the imperial office itself, not merely a female adjunct to male imperial power. Irene's unprecedented seizure of imperial power represents a moment of extraordinary disruption in Byzantine political tradition. The Roman imperial system, which the Byzantines considered themselves to be continuing, had never recognized a woman's right to rule in her own name. Empresses had exercised power as regents or as influential consorts, but the fiction of male imperial authority had always been maintained. Irene's rule challenged this fundamental assumption, creating a constitutional anomaly that her contemporaries struggled to accommodate. As this first phase of Irene's remarkable career drew to a close, the provincial girl from Athens had transformed herself into the sole ruler of what remained of the Roman Empire. From bride to empress consort to regent to emperor, Irene had navigated the treacherous currents of Byzantine politics with remarkable skill. Yet her greatest challenges still lay ahead. How would she govern as a woman in a system designed for male rule? How would the Byzantine elite, the church, and foreign powers respond to this unprecedented situation? And how would history judge the woman who had ordered the blinding of her own son to secure her grip on power? As you drift towards sleep, consider the extraordinary journey of Irene from her origins in Athens to the imperial palace in Constantinople, and the complex mixture of ambition, religious conviction, and ruthless determination that drove her unprecedented rise to power. What inner strength or what inner demons could propel a woman to such heights in a world designed to keep women subordinate? And what price did she pay, in her conscience and in her soul, for the power she so relentlessly pursued? To understand the significance of Empress Irene's religious policies, we must first step back and examine the theological controversy that had divided the Byzantine Empire for decades before her rise to power. The iconoclast controversy, a bitter dispute over the religious use of images, had profound implications not just for Byzantine spirituality, but for imperial authority, social cohesion, and international relations. It was against this complex backdrop that Irene would make her most lasting contribution to Byzantine history. The controversy began in the early 8th century during the reign of Emperor Leo III, 717–741 CE. Leo, a capable military leader, who had successfully defended Constantinople against an Arab siege, issued an edict in 730 CE prohibiting the veneration of religious images. This position, known as iconoclasm, literally image breaking, held that the creation and veneration of religious images violated the biblical prohibition against idolatry. Iconoclasts argued that no material image could adequately represent the divine nature of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints, and that attempting to do so was both theologically erroneous and spiritually dangerous. This was not merely an abstract, theological position, but an active policy of removing and destroying religious images that had been central to Byzantine devotional practice for centuries. Icons, painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, had come to play an essential role in Orthodox Christianity. For the average Byzantine Christian, icons served as windows to the divine, tangible points of connection with the spiritual world. Devotees would pray before icons, kiss them, light candles before them, and attribute miracles to their power. The iconoclast policy, therefore, represented a radical disruption of traditional religious practice. The motivations behind Leo III's iconoclast policy have been debated by historians. Some have suggested that it was influenced by Islamic prohibitions against religious imagery, as the Byzantine Empire was in constant contact and conflict with the expanding Islamic Caliphate. Others have emphasized internal Byzantine factors, including a desire to purify religious practice and to assert imperial authority over the Church. Whatever the precise motivation, the policy soon became a defining feature of imperial religious policy. Leo's son and successor, Constantine V, 741–775 CE, intensified the iconoclast position. Not merely content to remove images from churches, Constantine convened a church council in 754 CE, known as the Council of Hieria, which formally condemned the veneration of icons as heresy. This council provided theological justification for the iconoclast position and anathematized prominent defenders of icons, including John of Damascus, who had written eloquent defenses of religious imagery from the safety of Caliphate territory beyond Byzantine reach. Constantine V's iconoclasm was accompanied by active persecution of those who continued to venerate icons, particularly monks, who were among the most steadfast defenders of traditional practice. Monasteries were closed, monks were forced to marry or go into exile, and some particularly obstinate icon venerators were subjected to mutilation or execution. This persecution created deep divisions within Byzantine society and left lasting scars on the collective memory of the Orthodox Church. It was into this divided religious landscape that Irene of Athens entered when she married Leo IV, Constantine V's son, in 769 CE. Leo IV, 775–780 CE, maintained the official iconoclast position of his father and grandfather, but enforced it with less vigor. The persecution of icon venerators diminished, though the official prohibition remained in place. This relative moderation may have reflected Leo's recognition of the social divisions caused by his father's zealous enforcement of iconoclasm, or it may have been influenced by Irene herself, who is known to have maintained iconophile sympathies despite the official position of her husband's family. When Leo IV died in 780 CE and Irene assumed the regency for her young son Constantine VI, she inherited a religious situation characterized by official iconoclasm but widespread underground devotion to icons. Many Byzantines, particularly among the monastic community and the common people, had never accepted the iconoclast position despite decades of official enforcement. Icons had been hidden in private homes, venerated in secret, and preserved in territories beyond direct imperial control. The conditions were ripe for a change in policy if Irene could navigate the political complexities of such a reversal. Irene's own religious convictions appear to have aligned with the traditional veneration of icons. Her Athenian background may have predisposed her toward traditional practices, as provincial areas had generally been less affected by iconoclast policies than the capital and the army. Moreover, as a woman in a patriarchal society, Irene may have been drawn to the more personal, devotional aspects of Orthodox spirituality that icons facilitated, in contrast to the more abstract, philosophical approach favored by many iconoclast theologians. Whatever her personal motivations, Irene recognized that restoring icon veneration could serve her political interests as well as her religious convictions. By reversing the iconoclast policies of her predecessors, she could present herself as a restorer of tradition and orthodoxy, potentially gaining support from segments of Byzantine society that had been alienated by decades of iconoclast rule. The monastic community in particular represented a powerful potential ally for a female regent whose position was inherently precarious. Irene proceeded cautiously but deliberately in her religious reforms. Her first step, taken early in her regency, was to signal a change in atmosphere by allowing exiled iconophiles to return to Constantinople. Among these returned exiles were many monks who had suffered under Constantine VI's persecutions and who would become important allies in Irene's religious policy. This initial move was relatively modest. She did not immediately reverse official policy, but it sent a clear message about the direction of her intentions. The next significant step came in 784 CE when Patriarch Paul IV resigned his position. Paul had been appointed under Leo IV and had maintained the official iconoclast position. His resignation, ostensibly due to ill health but accompanied by expressions of remorse for his role in the iconoclast policies, created an opportunity for Irene to appoint a patriarch more aligned with her religious views. The man she selected was Tarasios, who had been serving as her principal secretary, Asicrates. The appointment of Tarasios was not without controversy. He was a layman at the time of his selection, and church canons generally required that high ecclesiastical offices be filled by men who had advanced through the clerical ranks. However, there were precedents for laymen being rapidly ordained and appointed to the patriarchate in exceptional circumstances. Tarasios was quickly taken through the necessary ordinations and installed as Patriarch of Constantinople on December 25, 784 CE. In his inaugural sermon, Tarasios indicated his support for convening an ecumenical council to address the icon controversy. This was a significant step, as ecumenical councils were the highest authority in the Orthodox Church, with the power to define doctrine and condemn heresy. 6 previous councils had been held, addressing various theological controversies, but none had dealt specifically with the question of icons. The Council of Hieria, convened by Constantine V in 754 CE, had not been recognized as ecumenical because it lacked representation from Rome and the other ancient patriarchates. Irene and Tarasios recognized that for a council addressing the icon controversy to be considered truly ecumenical, it would need to include representatives from Rome and the other major sees of Christianity. Accordingly, they sent letters to Pope Hadrian I and to the patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, inviting them to send representatives to the proposed council. These communications marked the beginning of a diplomatic effort to heal the religious divisions that had emerged during the iconoclast period, not only within the Byzantine Empire, but between Byzantium and Rome. Pope Hadrian thus responded positively to the invitation, though with certain conditions. He insisted on the unequivocal restoration of icon veneration and on the recognition of papal primacy. The Eastern patriarchs living under Muslim rule were more constrained in their ability to participate, but managed to send representatives. The stage was thus set for a council that would have the necessary authority to reverse the iconoclast position. The first attempt to convene the council in Constantinople in 786 CE ended in failure when soldiers loyal to the iconoclast position disrupted the proceedings. This incident revealed the continuing strength of iconoclast sentiment in the army, which had been shaped by decades of iconoclast leadership, particularly under the militarily successful Constantine V. For many soldiers, iconoclasm had become associated with Byzantine military prowess and imperial strength. Recognizing the seriousness of this threat to her religious reforms, Irene took decisive action. She disbanded the problematic military units and reorganized the army, placing trusted officers in key positions. This was a risky move given the empire's ongoing military challenges, but Irene prioritized her religious agenda over short-term military considerations. To mitigate the risk, she arranged for these troops to be sent on campaign to Asia Minor, effectively removing them from the capital. With these precautions in place, a second attempt to convene the council was made in 787 CE. This time, the location was moved from Constantinople to Nicaea in Bithynia, the site of the First Ecumenical Council in 325 CE, which had established the Nicene Creed. The choice of location was symbolically significant, linking the new council to the foundational event of Orthodox Christianity and implicitly claiming the same level of authority. The Second Council of Nicaea, as it came to be known, convened on September 24, 787 CE, with approximately 350 bishops in attendance. The council proceeded in a series of 8 sessions, during which the theological basis for icon veneration was carefully established. The bishops reviewed the scriptural and patristic evidence, considered the theological arguments on both sides, and examined the historical practice of the Church. A key theological distinction emerged in these deliberations between different types of reverence. The council distinguished between latreia, worship, which was due to God alone, and proskynesis, veneration, which could properly be offered to icons. This distinction allowed the council to affirm the veneration of icons, while avoiding the charge of idolatry. The council argued that the honor shown to an icon passes to the prototype, that is, when a Christian venerates an icon of Christ, the veneration passes to Christ himself, not to the material object. The council also addressed the Christological implications of the icon controversy. The iconoclasts had argued that to depict Christ was either to confine his divine nature to the limits of physical representation, a form of the heresy of Nestorianism, or to confuse his human and divine natures, a form of the heresy of monophysitism. The council countered that the possibility of depicting Christ was a consequence of the incarnation, because the Word had become flesh and dwelt among us, visible and tangible. It was appropriate to represent Christ in physical form. Indeed, to deny the propriety of depicting Christ could be seen as denying the reality of his human nature. On October 23, 787 CE, the council issued its final decree, restoring icon veneration as an orthodox practice and anathematizing iconoclasm. The definition of faith produced by the council affirmed that icons of Christ, the Virgin Mary, angels, and saints should be set up for veneration, as their veneration reflects honor to the persons represented and helps the faithful recall their virtues and strive to imitate them. The council rejected the decisions of the iconoclast Council of Hieria and rehabilitated the memory of those who had been condemned for defending icons. The final session of the council was held in Constantinople, in the Magnaura Palace, where Irene and her son Constantine VI ceremonially received and endorsed the council's decisions. This public endorsement was crucial for the implementation of the council's decrees, as it committed the imperial government to supporting the restoration of icon veneration throughout the empire. The Second Council of Nicaea represented a monumental achievement for Irene. In orchestrating this council and securing its endorsement of icon veneration, she had reversed 50 years of imperial religious policy and aligned the Byzantine Church with Rome and the other ancient patriarchates. The political significance of this religious shift cannot be overstated. By championing orthodox icon veneration, Irene positioned herself as a defender of tradition against what could now be characterized as the heretical innovations of her iconoclast predecessors. The implementation of the Council's decisions, however, faced significant challenges. Decades of iconoclast rule had left their mark on Byzantine society, particularly in the army and among certain segments of the aristocracy. The destruction of religious images had been so thorough in many areas that the practical work of restoring icons to churches and public spaces would take years. Moreover, iconoclast sentiment had not been eliminated by the Council's declarations. It continued to simmer beneath the surface, ready to re-emerge under favorable conditions. In the years following the Council, Irene took steps to consolidate its achievements. She patronized the creation of new icons and the restoration of those that had been preserved in hiding or in territories beyond iconoclast control. She supported the rebuilding and redecoration of churches that had been stripped of their imagery. She also encouraged the composition of liturgical texts celebrating the restoration of icons, embedding the triumph of iconophile orthodoxy in the daily worship life of the Byzantine Church. The restoration of icon veneration had significant cultural as well as religious implications. Byzantine art, which had been severely constrained during the iconoclast period, experienced a revival. The post-iconoclast period saw the development of new artistic styles and techniques, as artists sought to recover and extend the traditions that had been interrupted. Manuscript illumination, mosaics, frescoes, and ivory carvings all flourished under the patronage of Irene and subsequent Byzantine rulers. Relations with Rome also improved as a result of the Council. The papacy had consistently opposed iconoclasm and had been critical of Byzantine religious policy during the iconoclast period. The restoration of icon veneration removed a significant point of contention between the Byzantine Church and Rome. Pope Hadrian expressed approval of the Council's decisions, though he had reservations about some aspects of the proceedings and about the translation of the Council's acts into Latin, which he considered inadequate. Despite these successes, Irene's religious policy faced ongoing challenges. The Council had restored icon veneration as the official position of the Byzantine Church, but changing hearts and minds, especially among those who had been raised in the iconoclast tradition, was a more gradual process. Irene had to balance her commitment to iconophile orthodoxy with the practical need to maintain the unity and stability of the empire. The iconoclast controversy had never been purely theological. It had intersected with broader questions of imperial authority, the relationship between church and state, and the nature of Byzantine identity. By championing the restoration of icons, Irene had aligned herself with traditional Byzantine piety, but she had also challenged the religious policies associated with militarily successful emperors like Leo III and Constantine V. This created a complex legacy that would continue to shape Byzantine politics and religion long after her reign. As the sun sets on our exploration of the early phase of Irene's religious policy, we see a woman who skillfully used theological controversy to consolidate her political position, while also, it seems, acting from genuine religious conviction. The restoration of icon veneration through the Second Council of Nicaea stands as her most significant and lasting achievement, one that would earn her veneration as a saint in the Orthodox Church, despite the morally ambiguous aspects of her later career. Yet questions remain as we consider this remarkable chapter in Byzantine history. How deeply was Irene's religious policy shaped by political calculation versus personal faith? How did her status as a woman in a patriarchal society influence her approach to religious controversy? And how did her religious policies interact with the complex power dynamics of her relationship with her son, Constantine VI? As we drift towards sleep, these questions invite contemplation of the intricate interweaving of faith, power, and personal conviction in the life of this extraordinary woman. The immediate aftermath of the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE marked a period of relative religious harmony in the Byzantine Empire. Empress Irene had successfully orchestrated the restoration of icon veneration as the official position of the Church, aligning imperial religious policy with the traditional practices that had continued to be observed by many Byzantine Christians despite decades of official iconoclasm. This religious settlement appeared to solidify Irene's position as regent for her son Constantine VI, then 16 years old, and to enhance her legitimacy in the eyes of her subjects. The implementation of the council's decisions, however, was not a simple matter. 50 years of iconoclast policy had left a deep imprint on Byzantine society, particularly in the army and in certain segments of the aristocracy. Many churches had been stripped of their decorations, and the production of religious images had been severely curtailed. The practical work of restoring icons to their place in Byzantine religious life would take time, resources, and careful management. The restoration process began in Constantinople itself, where Irene could directly oversee the reintroduction of icons to the city's many churches. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the symbolic heart of Byzantine Christianity, received particular attention. Under iconoclast rule, the figurative mosaics that had once adorned its walls had been covered, over or replaced with abstract designs, primarily crosses and vegetal patterns. Now, artisans were commissioned to create new mosaic programs depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. This artistic restoration was not merely decorative, but deeply symbolic. Byzantine religious art was highly conventional, with specifics, rules governing how sacred subjects should be depicted. Icons were not viewed as artistic expressions in the modern sense, but as visual embodiments of theological truths. The careful restoration of these visual elements represented the restoration of Orthodox tradition in its fullness. The post-iconoclast artistic revival extended beyond the capital to provincial churches throughout the empire. In many cases, icons that had been hidden during the iconoclast period were returned to public veneration. These preserved icons often became objects of special devotion, their survival interpreted as miraculous confirmation of their sacred power. New icons were also created to replace those that had been destroyed, though the loss of artistic techniques during the iconoclast period meant that some of the sophistication of pre-iconoclast Byzantine art had to be gradually recovered. Monasteries played a crucial role in this artistic and religious revival. Monastic communities had been among the most steadfast opponents of iconoclasm, often suffering persecution for their defense of traditional practices. With the restoration of icon veneration, monasteries flourished once again as centers of spiritual life, icon production, and manuscript copying. The Studion monastery in Constantinople, led by the influential abbot Theodore, became particularly important in this period as a center of intellectual and spiritual renewal. Beyond the physical restoration of icons, Irene's religious policy involved a broader rehabilitation of the defenders of icons who had suffered under iconoclast rule. The memories of those who had been persecuted, exiled, or executed for their defense of icons were now honored. Hagiographical texts were composed celebrating these confessors of orthodoxy, and their stories became part of the liturgical commemoration of the Byzantine Church. This process helped to create a narrative of Orthodox resistance to imperial heresy that would become an important part of Byzantine religious identity. The liturgical life of the Byzantine Church also reflected the triumph of icon veneration. New hymns and prayers were composed celebrating the restoration of icons, and the council itself was commemorated annually. The triumph of orthodoxy, marking the final restoration of icons in 843 CE after a brief second period of iconoclasm, eventually became a major feast in the Orthodox calendar, celebrated on the first Sunday of Lent with a special service that includes the anathematization of various heresies, including iconoclasm. The religious settlement achieved at the Second Council of Nicaea had significant implications for Byzantine relations with the wider Christian world. The papacy in Rome had consistently opposed iconoclasm and had been critical of Byzantine religious policy during the iconoclast period. Pope Hadrian I expressed approval of the council's decisions, though he had reservations about some aspects of the proceedings and about the translation of the council's acts into Latin, which he considered inadequate. This improvement in relations with Rome coincided with a period of significant change in the political landscape of the Western Mediterranean. The Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne was expanding its territories and increasing its political and cultural influence. In 774 CE, Charlemagne had conquered the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy, bringing Frankish power to the borders of Byzantine territories in southern Italy. This proximity created both potential for conflict and opportunities for alliance. Recognizing the growing importance of the Frankish kingdom, Irene had initiated diplomatic contacts with Charlemagne. In 781 CE, a betrothal was arranged between Constantine VI, then 10 years old, and Rotrud, Charlemagne's daughter. This proposed marriage alliance would have created a powerful bond between the two most significant Christian powers of the era and potentially aligned their religious policies. However, the restoration of icon veneration created an unexpected complication in Byzantine-Frankish relations. When the Acts of the Second Council of Nicaea were translated into Latin and sent to Charlemagne, they were poorly received, partly due to translation errors that obscured the Council's careful distinction between veneration, proskynesis, and worship, latreia. Frankish theologians misunderstood the Council's position. They believed that the Byzantines were advocating the worship of images, which they considered idolatrous. In response, Charlemagne commissioned a detailed critique of the Council's acts known as the Libri Carolini, Charlemagne's books. This text rejected both iconoclasm and what it perceived as Byzantine image worship, advocating instead a middle position in which images could be used for education and decoration, but not venerated. In 794 CE, a Frankish church council held at Frankfurt formally rejected the Second Council of Nicaea, creating a significant theological rift between the Byzantine East and the Frankish West. This religious disagreement coincided with a deterioration in political relations between Byzantium and the Franks. In 788 CE, Irene had broken off the betrothal between Constantine VI and Rotrud, choosing instead to have her son marry Maria of Amnia, a woman from a relatively obscure Byzantine family. This diplomatic reversal may have been motivated by Irene's concern about Charlemagne's growing power in Italy, or by her desire to ensure that Constantine's wife would not encourage him to assert his independence from his mother's control. The cancellation of the betrothal and the religious disagreement over icons contributed to a cooling of Byzantine-Frankish relations that would have significant long-term consequences. The growing estrangement between the two major Christian powers created a vacuum in which misunderstandings could flourish, and in which the religious and cultural differences between the Greek East and the Latin West could harden into more permanent divisions. Within the Byzantine Empire, the restoration of icon veneration was generally popular, particularly among the common people and the monastic community. The veneration of icons was deeply ingrained in Byzantine popular piety, offering a tangible connection to the divine that was especially important in a world where literacy was limited and abstract theological concepts were difficult for many to grasp. For the average Byzantine, the ability to once again openly venerate the sacred images that had been part of their spiritual heritage was a source of genuine joy. However, iconoclast sentiment had not been eliminated by the Council's declarations. It continued to exist, particularly in the army and among certain aristocratic families that had risen to prominence during the iconoclast period. These lingering iconoclast sympathies created a potential base of opposition to Irene's regime, especially if they could be combined with other grievances. The years following the Second Council of Nicaea coincided with a period of increasing tension between Irene and her son Constantine VI. As Constantine approached adulthood, he naturally sought a greater role in the governance of the empire that was nominally his. Irene, however, had developed a taste for power and showed little inclination to step aside. This personal and political conflict intersected with the religious issues in complex ways. Constantine himself does not appear to have had strong iconoclast sympathies. He had been raised under his mother's influence and had publicly endorsed the decisions of the Second Council of Nicaea. However, as tensions with his mother increased, Constantine began to look for sources of support among the military and aristocratic classes, some of whom maintained iconoclast leanings. This created the potential for religious policy to become entangled with the struggle for power between mother and son. The power dynamics shifted dramatically in 790 CE when a military revolt led to Constantine VI assuming full imperial power and temporarily sidelining his mother. This period of Constantine's independent rule, which lasted until 792 CE, did not see a reversal of the religious policy established at Nicaea. Constantine maintained the official position in favor of icon veneration, suggesting that he recognized the popularity of this policy among the broader population and its importance for relations with Rome and the Eastern Patriarchates. When Irene returned to a position of shared power with Constantine in 792 CE, following the suppression of a plot against him, the religious settlement remained stable. Both mother and son maintained their support for icon veneration while continuing their political maneuvering against each other. The religious consensus achieved at Nicaea had proven durable enough to withstand the personal and political conflicts at the highest level of the imperial government. However, a new religious controversy soon emerged that would have significant implications for the power struggle between Irene and Constantine. In 795 CE, Constantine decided to divorce his wife Maria of Amnia, who had not provided him with a male heir, and to marry Theodote, a lady-in-waiting with whom he had fallen in love. This decision created a serious religious problem, as the Orthodox Church viewed divorce with strong disapproval, particularly when not justified by serious offenses such as adultery. Patriarch Tarasios, who owed his position to Irene but was also subject to Constantine's authority as emperor, found himself in a difficult position. He refused to perform the marriage himself but did not actively prevent it, allowing a priest named Joseph to conduct the ceremony in August 795 CE. This compromise satisfied neither side of the emerging religious controversy. The monastic community, led by Theodore of Studium, was outraged by what they saw as a clear violation of Christian teaching. Theodore not only condemned Constantine's divorce, but also criticized Patriarch Tarasios for failing to take a stronger stand against it. This controversy, which came to be known as the Mykian controversy, from the Greek moicheia, meaning adultery, created a significant rift in Byzantine religious life. Irene's position in this controversy is particularly interesting. Though she had been reconciled with her son and shared power with him, she appears to have opposed his divorce and remarriage. This opposition may have been motivated by genuine religious conviction, but it also aligned with her political interests. The marriage controversy had weakened Constantine's standing with important segments of Byzantine society, particularly the influential monastic community that had supported Irene's iconophile policies. This created an opportunity for Irene to gather support for a potential return to power. The religious and political tensions came to a head in 797 CE when Irene orchestrated a coup against her son. Constantine was seized, blinded, and imprisoned, effectively ending his reign. Irene now assumed full imperial power, becoming the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, rather than as a regent or consort. This unprecedented development had significant implications for Byzantine religious life as well as for political institutions. Irene's seizure of power was legitimized in part by Constantine's perceived moral and religious failings, particularly his controversial divorce and remarriage. By positioning herself as a defender of orthodox morality against her son's transgressions, Irene was able to secure support from the monastic community and other religiously conservative elements in Byzantine society. The fact that she had previously championed the restoration of icon veneration enhanced her credentials as a defender of orthodoxy. One of Irene's first acts after seizing full power was to address the religious controversy that had emerged from Constantine's divorce. She removed Joseph, the priest who had performed the marriage to Theodote, from his ecclesiastical position and restored full communion with the Studion monks who had protested against the divorce. This action solidified her alliance with the monastic community and reinforced her image as a champion of orthodox religious principles. Irene's religious policy during her sole rule, 797–802 CE, was characterized by continued support for icon veneration and for traditional Orthodox practices more generally. She maintained close relationships with leading figures in the Byzantine Church, particularly in the monastic community, and used her patronage to support religious institutions. Churches and monasteries received lands and privileges, and religious art continued to flourish under imperial sponsorship. The religious stability achieved during Irene's sole rule represented the culmination of her efforts to reverse the iconoclast policies of her predecessors. The Second Council of Nicaea had provided the theological foundation for the restoration of icon veneration, and Irene's consistent support for this position throughout her political career had helped to make the change permanent. By the end of the 8th century, icon veneration had been fully re-established as the orthodox position of the Byzantine Church. This achievement was all the more remarkable given the political challenges that Irene faced as the first woman to rule the empire in her own right. Byzantine political theory had no provision for female rule, and Irene's position was inherently anomalous. That she was able to maintain religious stability and even strengthen her alliance with the Church during this period testifies to her political skill and to the genuine support that her religious policies had generated. However, Irene's religious policies also had unintended consequences for Byzantine relations with the West. In 800 CE, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in Rome. This momentous event, which established a rival imperial authority in the West, was partly justified by the claim that the imperial throne in Constantinople was vacant because a woman could not legitimately hold imperial power. The religious disagreements that had emerged over the interpretation of the Second Council of Nicaea contributed to the estrangement between Byzantium and the Frankish kingdom that made this development possible. Some Byzantine sources suggest that, in response to Charlemagne's coronation, negotiations were initiated for a possible marriage between Irene and Charlemagne, which would have united the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Whether these negotiations were serious or merely diplomatic maneuvering remains unclear. In any case, they came to nothing, as Irene was deposed in 802 CE by a conspiracy of court officials led by the finance minister Nikephoros, who became the next emperor. Irene's deposition and the end of her unprecedented female rule did not, however, lead to a reversal of her religious policies. Nikephoros I, 802–811 CE, and subsequent Byzantine emperors maintained the official position in favor of icon veneration established at the Second Council of Nicaea. This continuity suggests that Irene's religious settlement had achieved broad acceptance within Byzantine society, regardless of the controversial nature of her personal rule. The stability of Irene's religious settlement was tested in the early 9th century When a second period of iconoclasm was imposed by Emperor Leo, this revival of iconoclasm was motivated partly by military setbacks that were interpreted as divine punishment for the veneration of icons, echoing the reasoning that had led to the original iconoclast policies under Leo III. However, this second iconoclast period was shorter and less intense than the first, and it ended with the definitive restoration of icon veneration in 843 CE under Empress Theodora, who, like Irene, served as regent for a young son. The final restoration of icon veneration in 843 CE, commemorated annually in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy, can be seen as the fulfillment of the work that Irene had begun at the Second Council of Nicaea. The Council's theological arguments in favor of icon veneration provided the foundation for this enduring settlement, and Irene's political support for the iconophile position helped to ensure that it would eventually prevail, despite the temporary revival of iconoclasm. Irene's role in the restoration of icon veneration earned her lasting recognition in the Orthodox Church. Despite the morally ambiguous aspects of her career, particularly the blinding of her son, she is venerated as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Her feast day is August 9th, and she is commemorated specifically for her role in restoring the veneration of icons. This religious commemoration represents a recognition of the genuine importance of her contribution to Orthodox theology and practice. The iconoclast controversy and its resolution under Irene had profound implications for Byzantine art, theology, and religious practice. The post-iconoclast period saw a flowering of Byzantine religious art, with the development of new iconographic programs and artistic techniques. The theological arguments formulated at the Second Council of Nicaea became a permanent part of Orthodox doctrine, and the veneration of icons remains central to Orthodox religious practice to this day. Moreover, the controversy and its resolution helped to shape Byzantine identity in opposition to both Islamic prohibitions against religious imagery and later Western Christian positions that were perceived as inadequately respectful of icons. The Byzantine approach to religious art, characterized by conventional representation, gold backgrounds, and inverse perspective, became a distinctive marker of Eastern Orthodox visual culture. As we reflect on Irene's role in the iconoclast controversy, we see a woman who combined personal religious conviction with political acumen to achieve a lasting change in Byzantine religious policy. Her success in restoring icon veneration represents her most significant and enduring legacy, one that transcends the more morally ambiguous aspects of her political career. In the realm of religious policy, Irene of Athens truly left her mark on the Byzantine Empire and on the Orthodox Church that was so central to Byzantine identity. But as the echoes of hymns praising the restoration of icons fade into the gentle rhythms of sleep, a question lingers. How might Byzantine history have unfolded differently had Irene failed in her religious reforms? Would iconoclasm have remained the official position of the Byzantine Church, creating a permanent rift with Rome and the Eastern Patriarchates? And how might such an alternative religious landscape have affected the political and cultural development of the medieval world? In the soft darkness of approaching slumber, these counterfactual musings invite us to appreciate the genuine historical significance of Irene's religious achievements. The religious settlement that Empress Irene had established through the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE and reinforced during her subsequent periods of power represented more than a theological position. It was a comprehensive vision of the relationship between the divine and human realms, mediated through sacred images. To fully appreciate the significance of Irene's religious policies, we must examine how the restoration of icon veneration affected the daily spiritual practices of Byzantine Christians and how it shaped the distinctive visual culture of Byzantium. In the Byzantine world, icons were not merely decorative art or visual aids for the illiterate. as they were sometimes characterized in Western Christianity. Rather, they were understood as sacred presences, windows to heaven through which divine grace could flow into the material world. The typical Byzantine church interior was adorned with a carefully organized program of images hierarchically arranged to reflect theological truths. In the dome, the highest point of the church, one would typically find an image of Christ Pantocrator, the all-ruler, gazing down upon the congregation with a solemn, majestic expression. Below, on the walls and in the apse, would be arranged images of the Virgin Mary, angels, apostles, and saints, creating a visual community of heaven and earth united in worship. The restoration of these sacred programs under Irene's patronage transformed the experience of worship for ordinary Byzantines. Where before they had encountered empty walls or abstract decorations, now they once again stood in the presence of sacred figures rendered in glowing mosaic or painted fresco. The sensory dimension of Orthodox worship, with its incense, chanting, and visual splendor, was restored to its full richness, creating an environment in which the faithful could feel transported from the mundane world into a foretaste of heaven. Byzantine devotional practices centered around these sacred images. The typical Orthodox Christian would enter a church, light a candle before an icon, make the sign of the cross, bow, and kiss the icon. Similar practices would occur in homes where family icon corners served as focal points for daily prayers. These physical interactions with sacred images were understood as ways of connecting with the holy persons represented, not as worship of the material objects themselves. This distinction, carefully articulated at the Second Council of Nicaea, allowed for a deeply physical, sensory form of devotion that nonetheless avoided the theological pitfalls of idolatry. The restoration of icon veneration under Irene also had significant implications for the monastic life that was so central to Byzantine spirituality. Byzantine monasticism encompassed a variety of forms, from the eremitic, solitary lifestyle of hermits to the cenobitic, communal arrangements of large monasteries. In all these contexts, icons played an important role in devotional practice. Monks and nuns spent hours in prayer before icons, using them as aids to contemplation and as focuses for intercessory prayer. The production of icons was itself a monastic activity, with many of the finest Byzantine icons created in monastery workshops by monks who approached their work as a form of spiritual practice. During the iconoclast period, monastic communities had been particularly targeted for persecution, as they were among the most steadfast defenders of icon veneration. Many monasteries had been closed, their properties confiscated, and their members forced to disperse, marry, or conform to iconoclast practices. Irene's restoration of icon veneration allowed for the revival of these communities, which in turn became important supporters of her regime. Monasteries like the Studian in Constantinople, led by the influential abbot Theodore, became centers of intellectual and spiritual renewal, contributing to a broader cultural revival in the post-iconoclast period. This cultural revival extended to the production of illuminated manuscripts, another area where religious imagery had been suppressed during the iconoclast era. Byzantine manuscript illumination was a sophisticated art form that combined text and image in carefully designed arrangements. Religious manuscripts such as Gospels, Psalters, and liturgical books were adorned with miniature paintings depicting biblical scenes and portraits of holy figures. These illuminations not only beautified the texts, but also served as visual commentaries on them, drawing out theological implications and emphasizing particular interpretations. The restoration of manuscript illumination under Irene contributed to the preservation and transmission of both religious texts and the artistic traditions associated with them. Byzantine manuscript workshops maintain techniques and iconographic traditions that might otherwise have been lost, ensuring the continuity of cultural memory during a period of significant disruption. The manuscripts produced in this era served not only religious purposes but also diplomatic ones, as luxury copies were often presented as gifts to foreign rulers and dignitaries, projecting Byzantine cultural prestige abroad. Beyond the strictly religious sphere, the restoration of icons and veneration had broader cultural implications. Byzantine art had always been characterized by a high degree of convention and formality, with specific rules governing how sacred subjects should be depicted. The interruption of artistic production during the iconoclast period had threatened the continuity of these conventions. The post-iconoclast artistic revival under Irene and her successors involved both the recovery of older traditions and the development of new styles and techniques. One notable development in this period was the increased emphasis on the emotional and human aspects of sacred figures. While still adhering to the formal conventions of Byzantine art, post-iconoclast images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints often displayed a greater sense of tenderness and emotional expressiveness. This can be seen, for example, in the evolution of the Theotokos, Mother of God, image type known as the Eleusa, the Merciful, which depicts the Virgin holding the Christ child with their cheeks touching in a gesture of maternal affection. This type became increasingly popular in the post-iconoclast period, reflecting a devotional emphasis on the human and compassionate aspects of the divine. The influence of Irene's religious policies extended beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Orthodox churches that developed in regions like Bulgaria, Serbia, and Rus, later Russia, adopted the Byzantine approach to religious imagery, including the theological understanding articulated at the Second Council of Nicaea, and the artistic conventions that evolved in the post-iconoclast period. The distinctive visual culture of these regions, with its emphasis on icons, church frescoes, and hieratic representation, owes much to the religious settlement that Irene helped to establish. However, the restoration of icon veneration also contributed to the growing divergence between Eastern and Western Christianity. While Rome had supported the iconophile position during the iconoclast controversy, the Western understanding of religious images was somewhat different from the Byzantine one. Western religious art tended to be more narrative and didactic, less bound by formal conventions and less integrated into devotional practice. These differences, combined with the linguistic and cultural barriers between the Greek East and Latin West, created conditions for misunderstanding and eventual estrangement. The misinterpretation of the Second Council of Nicaea's position by Frankish theologians, as reflected in the Libri Carolini, illustrates this growing divergence. Charlemagne and his theological advisors rejected both iconoclasm and what they perceived as Byzantine image worship, advocating instead a middle position in which images could be used for education and decoration, but not venerated. This position reflected a different understanding of the relationship between the material and spiritual realms, one that would eventually contribute to the Great Schism between Eastern and Western Christianity in 1054 CE. Irene's religious policies also had significant political dimensions both domestically and internationally. Within the Byzantine Empire, the restoration of icon veneration helped to reconcile the imperial government with the monastic community and with segments of the population that had maintained iconophile sympathies despite official persecution. This reconciliation strengthened the social fabric of the empire at a time when external threats from Arabs, Bulgars, and other neighboring powers required internal cohesion. Internationally, the restoration of icon veneration improved Byzantine relations with the papacy and with the Eastern Patriarchates, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, all of which had opposed iconoclasm. This alignment with the traditional centers of Christianity enhanced Byzantine prestige and legitimacy in the wider Christian world. However, as we have seen, It also contributed to tensions with the emerging Frankish power under Charlemagne, setting the stage for the development of rival imperial claims in the east and west. The political significance of Irene's religious policies became particularly apparent during her unprecedented period of sole rule from 797 to 802 CE. As the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, Irene faced significant challenges to her legitimacy. Byzantine political theory had no provision for female rule, and the empire's military and administrative structures were designed for male leadership. Irene's status as a champion of orthodox religious policy helped to compensate for these disadvantages, providing a source of legitimacy that partially offset the anomaly of her gender. The support of the monastic community was particularly important for Irene during this period. Monasteries served not only as centers of religious life but also as repositories of cultural authority and as networks for the dissemination of ideas. The backing of influential abbots like Theodore of Studion provided Irene with a form of moral authority that helped to sustain her rule despite its constitutional irregularity. This alliance between imperial power and monastic authority, founded on shared commitment to icon veneration, became a significant feature of Byzantine politics in subsequent centuries. Irene's religious policies also had economic dimensions. The production of icons and other religious art required skilled craftsmen, expensive materials, and organized workshops. The restoration of icon veneration stimulated this sector of the Byzantine economy, creating employment for artisans and opportunities for artistic patronage. Similarly, the revival of monasticism under Irene's patronage had economic effects, as monasteries were significant economic units that owned land, employed workers, and engaged in various productive activities from agriculture to manuscript copying. The material culture associated with icon veneration extended beyond the icons themselves to include lamps, censers, candle holders, and other liturgical objects. These items were often made of precious metals and adorned with religious imagery, requiring the skills of metalworkers, jewelers, and other specialized craftsmen. The production and use of these objects represented a significant sector of the Byzantine economy, one that had been suppressed during the iconoclast period and was revived under Irene's patronage. The restoration of icon veneration also had implications for the built environment of the Byzantine Empire. Churches that had been stripped of their decorations during the iconoclast period were readorned with mosaics, frescoes, and other forms of religious art. In some cases, new churches were built or older ones extensively renovated to accommodate the restored practice of icon veneration. These construction and decoration projects required the skills of architects, masons, mosaic workers, and other building craftsmen, stimulating economic activity in these sectors. Despite the comprehensive nature of Irene's religious settlement, iconoclast sentiments did not disappear entirely from Byzantine society. The army, in particular, maintained a tradition of iconoclast sympathy, partly due to the association of iconoclasm with the militarily successful emperors Leo III and Constantine V. This lingering iconoclast tendency would resurface in the early 9th century, when Emperor Leo V revived iconoclast policies following military setbacks that were interpreted as divine punishment for the veneration of icons. This second iconoclast period, 815–843 CE, was shorter and less severe than the first, and it ended with the definitive restoration of icon veneration under Empress Theodora, who, like Irene, served as regent for a young son. The theological arguments developed at the Second Council of Nicaea provided the foundation for this final victory of the iconophile position, which is celebrated annually in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy on the first Sunday of Lent. Irene's role in laying the groundwork for this eventual triumph earned her veneration as a saint in the Orthodox Church despite the morally problematic aspects of her political career, particularly the blinding of her son. This religious commemoration reflects the genuine importance of her contribution to Orthodox theology and practice, which has endured long after the political circumstances of her rule have faded into historical obscurity. The enduring legacy of Irene's religious policies can be seen in the central role that icons continue to play in Orthodox Christianity. The theology of icons articulated at the Second Council of Nicaea remains authoritative in the Orthodox Church, and the devotional practices associated with icons, bowing, kissing, lighting candles, continue to be integral to Orthodox spiritual life. The distinctive visual culture of Orthodox Christianity, with its emphasis on conventional representation, gold backgrounds, and inverse perspective, traces its lineage back to the artistic revival that followed the restoration of icon veneration under Irene. Moreover, the iconoclast controversy and its resolution under Irene have become part of the Orthodox Church's understanding of its own history. The triumph over iconoclasm is seen as a vindication of Orthodox tradition against innovation, of the physical and sensory dimensions of faith against abstraction, and of the capacity of material reality to mediate divine presence. These themes have informed Orthodox self-understanding in its encounters with other religious traditions, particularly Western Christianity and Islam. As our exploration of Irene's religious policies draws to a close, we are left with an appreciation of the profound and lasting impact of her decisions. In championing the restoration of icon veneration, she helped to shape not only the theological positions of the Orthodox Church, but also its devotional practices, its visual culture, and its understanding of the relationship between the divine and human realms. This religious legacy has outlasted the empire itself, continuing to influence the spiritual lives of millions of Orthodox Christians around the world. Yet as we transition towards slumber, a final question lingers. What personal spiritual conviction animated Irene's religious policies? Was she genuinely moved by the theological arguments for icon veneration, or were her actions primarily calculated to secure political advantage? The historical record provides no definitive answer, as is often the case with questions of interior motivation. Perhaps the truth lies in a complex interweaving of sincere belief and political calculation, reflecting the inseparability of religion and politics in the Byzantine world. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep, you might contemplate the enigmatic figure of Irene, a woman whose private faith helped to shape the public religion of an empire and beyond. The relationship between Empress Irene and her son Constantine VI represents one of the most complex and ultimately tragic mother-son dynamics in Byzantine history. What began as a conventional regency arrangement, a widowed empress governing on behalf of her underage son, evolved into a protracted power struggle that would end in an act of shocking brutality. To understand this dysfunctional imperial relationship, we must examine its origins in Constantine's childhood and early adolescence, the political context that shaped both mother and son, and the cultural expectations that governed imperial succession in Byzantium. Constantine VI was born on January 14, 771 CE in the imperial porphyra chamber of the Great Palace in Constantinople. This purple-decorated room was reserved for imperial births, and children born there were given the prestigious designation porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, signifying their legitimacy and right to imperial succession. Constantine was the only child of Emperor Leo IV and Empress Irene, making him the sole direct heir to the Byzantine throne from the moment of his birth. As an imperial prince, Constantine's childhood would have been carefully structured and supervised. Byzantine imperial education combined intellectual training with preparation for the ceremonial and administrative responsibilities of rulership. Young princes studied with carefully selected tutors who instructed them in subjects ranging from rhetoric and philosophy to military strategy and statecraft. They were also taught the elaborate ceremonial that governed court life, preparing them for the highly ritualized role they would eventually assume. Constantine's early childhood coincided with his father's brief reign, 775–780 CE. During these years, the young prince would have been mostly under the care of his mother and her female attendants in the Gynaeconitis, the women's quarters of the imperial palace. His public appearances would have been limited to carefully choreographed ceremonial occasions where his presence served to reinforce the continuity of the imperial succession. The sudden death of Leo IV in September 780 CE, when Constantine was only 9 years old, catapulted the young prince to the imperial throne and dramatically changed the trajectory of his childhood. Given his youth, a regency was necessary, and his mother Irene naturally assumed this role. This arrangement was not unprecedented in Byzantine history. Previous empresses had served as regents for underage sons, though few had exercised power as decisively as Irene would. The early years of Irene's regency appear to have been relatively harmonious, at least as far as her relationship with her son was concerned. Constantine continued his education under the supervision of tutors appointed by his mother, while Irene handled the practical business of government. The young emperor appeared alongside his mother at important ceremonial occasions, learning the public role he would eventually assume in full. One significant decision made during these early years concerned Constantine's future marriage. In 781 CE, when Constantine was 10 years old, a betrothal was arranged between him and Rotrud, a daughter of Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish king who was expanding his control over much of Western Europe. This proposed alliance with the Franks represented a significant diplomatic initiative, potentially creating a powerful bond between the two most important Christian powers of the era. To prepare for the eventual marriage, a Frankish teacher was sent to Constantinople to instruct Rotrud in Greek language and Byzantine customs. Meanwhile, a Byzantine tutor was assigned to teach Constantine the Latin language. These arrangements suggest that the planned marriage was taken seriously by both courts and that significant effort was being invested in its success. As Constantine entered adolescence, the dynamics of his relationship with his mother began to shift. Byzantine imperial ideology emphasized the absolute authority of the reigning emperor, a principle that was difficult to reconcile with a regency situation where real power was exercised by another. As Constantine grew older, questions naturally arose about when he would assume his rightful place as sole emperor. The traditional age of majority for Byzantine emperors was not fixed by law, but was generally understood to be around 16 or 17 years old. By 787 CE, when the Second Council of Nicaea was convened to restore icon veneration, Constantine was 16 and approaching the age when he might reasonably be expected to begin taking a more active role in government. However, there are indications that Irene was reluctant to relinquish the power she had come to enjoy during her years as regent. This reluctance became increasingly apparent in 788 CE, when Irene suddenly broke off Constantine's betrothal to Rotrud, the daughter of Charlemagne. The reasons for this diplomatic reversal are not entirely clear from the sources. Some historians have suggested that Irene had become concerned about Charlemagne's growing power in Italy and wanted to distance Byzantium from the Frankish ruler. Others have proposed that she feared a Frankish wife might encourage Constantine to assert his independence from his mother's control. Instead of the Frankish princess, Irene selected a local woman named Maria of Amnia as Constantine's bride. Maria came from an undistinguished family with no independent power base, making her less likely to encourage Constantine toward independence. The marriage took place in November 788 CE, when Constantine was 17 years old. By this time, Constantine had reached an age at which he could reasonably be expected to begin taking a more active role in government. Yet, Irene showed little inclination to hand over power to her son. She continued to dominate government, making decisions and issuing orders in her own name, as well as Constantine's. This situation created growing tension at court, as Constantine naturally sought a greater role in the empire he was nominally ruling. The tension erupted into open conflict in 790 CE, when a group of military officials attempted to proclaim Constantine as sole ruler, without Irene's regency. The plot was discovered before it could be fully implemented, and Irene moved swiftly to punish those involved. The leaders of the conspiracy were exiled, and Constantine himself was disciplined, though not harmed. Irene went so far as to demand that the army renew its oath of loyalty, swearing allegiance to her first and to Constantine second, a clear indication of her determination to maintain her position. This attempt to sideline Constantine, however, proved to be a miscalculation on Irene's part. The Armenian regiment of the imperial army stationed in Constantinople refused to accept this reversal of the natural order. In their view, Constantine was now old enough to rule, and continuing to subordinate him to his mother was improper. In October 790 CE, they rose in revolt, demanding that Constantine be recognized as sole emperor. Faced with military opposition, Irene was forced to yield. Constantine VI, now 19 years old, assumed full imperial power, while Irene was relegated to a secondary position. She retained the title of Empress, but was removed from active participation in government. Some sources suggest that she was briefly exiled to one of the imperial palaces outside Constantinople, though this exile, if it occurred, was short-lived. This moment of Constantine's political emancipation from his mother represents a crucial turning point in their relationship and in Byzantine history more broadly. After a decade of serving as the power behind the throne, Irene was suddenly displaced, her carefully constructed networks of influence disrupted. For Constantine, the challenge was equally significant. After years of being kept away from the practical business of government, he now had to prove himself capable of ruling an empire facing significant external threats and internal divisions. Constantine's independent rule, however, proved to be problematic from the start. Though he had received an imperial education, his practical experience in governance was limited due to Irene's domination of affairs during his adolescence. He lacked the political skills necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of Byzantine court politics, and he struggled to command the respect of experienced officials who had served under his mother. The young emperor's difficulties were compounded by the fact that Irene had cultivated a strong base of support during her years as regent, particularly among court eunuchs and the monastic community that had benefited from her restoration of icon veneration. These groups remained loyal to Irene even after her official removal from power, creating a shadow court that undermined Constantine's authority. In military matters, Constantine showed more promise than in civil administration. In 791 CE, he led a campaign against the Bulgars, though it achieved little concrete success. The following year, he campaigned against the Arabs in Asia Minor, with somewhat better results. These military activities were important not only for the defense of the empire, but also for establishing Constantine's authority. Byzantine emperors were expected to lead armies in person, and military success was a crucial component of imperial prestige. Despite these efforts, Constantine's position remained precarious. By 792 CE, dissatisfaction with his rule had grown to the point where a plot was formed to replace him with his uncle Nikephoros, one of Leo IV's brothers, who had been ordained as priests early in Irene's regency. The conspiracy was discovered, and Constantine responded with harsh punishments. Nikephoros was blinded, and his 4 brothers had their tongues cut out, ensuring they could never serve as figureheads for future rebellions. These mutilations, while cruel by modern standards, were considered relatively humane in Byzantine political practice. Blinding in particular was a common fate for deposed emperors or dangerous rivals, as it rendered them ineligible for the throne, the emperor being considered God's representative on earth and therefore required to be physically perfect without the moral stain of execution. Following the suppression of this plot, Constantine took the surprising step of recalling his mother to court and restoring her to a position of influence. The precise motivation for this reconciliation is unclear. Perhaps Constantine recognized his own limitations and valued his mother's political experience, or perhaps he sought to reconcile competing factions at court. Whatever the reason, by early 792 CE, Irene had returned to a position of shared power, with official documents once again naming both Constantine and Irene as rulers. This power-sharing arrangement persisted for the next 5 years, though the balance of authority between mother and son fluctuated. Constantine continued to lead military campaigns and to make appointments to high office, while Irene maintained significant influence, particularly in matters of court ceremony and religious policy. The relationship between them appears to have been one of uneasy cooperation rather than genuine reconciliation, with each maintaining their own supporters and pursuing sometimes divergent agendas. The complex dynamic between Irene and Constantine was further complicated by Constantine's personal life. His marriage to Maria of Amnia, arranged by Irene in 788 CE, had produced a daughter but no sons, creating anxiety about the continuation of the dynasty. Moreover, Constantine had fallen in love with a court lady named Theodote, a cousin of the famous abbot Theodore of Studion. By 795 CE, Constantine had determined to divorce Maria and marry Theodote, a decision that would have profound consequences for his reign and for his relationship with his mother. Divorce and remarriage, while permitted under Byzantine civil law under certain circumstances, were viewed with disapproval by the Church, particularly when not justified by serious offences such as adultery. Constantine's desire to divorce Maria solely because he had fallen in love with another woman and wanted a male heir was considered insufficient grounds by church authorities. Nevertheless, Constantine pressed forward with his plan, forcing Maria to enter a convent, a common fate for discarded imperial wives, and proceeding with preparations to marry Theodote. This action placed the patriarch Tarasios in a difficult position. As the highest religious authority in the empire, he was expected to uphold church teaching on marriage. Yet as an imperial appointee who owed his position to the imperial family, he was reluctant to directly oppose the emperor's will. Tarasios chose a middle path. He refused to perform the marriage himself, but did not actively prevent it, allowing a priest named Joseph to conduct the ceremony in August 795 CE. The emperor's divorce and remarriage provoked a serious religious controversy. The monastic community in particular was outraged by what they saw as a clear violation of Christian teaching. Theodore of Studion, whose monastery had become a center of strict Orthodox observance, emerged as a leading critic of the emperor's actions. He not only condemned Constantine's divorce, but also criticized Patriarch Tarasios for failing to take a stronger stand against it. This controversy, which came to be known as the Mucian controversy, from the Greek moicheia, meaning adultery, created a significant rift in Byzantine society. The monks of the Studian monastery and their supporters refused to recognize Constantine's new marriage or to remain in communion with the clergy who had sanctioned it. The emperor responded with persecutions, exiling Theodore and other outspoken critics to distant provinces. Irene's position in this controversy is particularly revealing. Though she had been reconciled with her son and shared power with him, the sources indicate that she opposed his divorce and remarriage. This opposition was likely motivated by a combination of genuine religious conviction and political calculation. The controversy had weakened Constantine's standing with important segments of Byzantine society, particularly the influential monastic community that had supported Irene's religious policies. This created an opportunity for Irene to gather support for a potential return to power. The marriage controversy coincided with military setbacks that further undermined Constantine's position. In 796 CE, he led an unsuccessful campaign against the Bulgars, during which he panicked and fled the battlefield, abandoning his troops. This military failure damaged his reputation among the army, traditionally one of the strongest supports of imperial authority. By 797 CE, Constantine's position had been severely weakened by the combination of religious controversy, military failure, and his own political missteps. Irene, sensing her opportunity, began to plot her son's overthrow. She assembled a group of conspirators, including prominent court eunuchs and other officials who had remained loyal to her throughout the ups and downs of her political career. The conspiracy came to fruition in August 797 CE. According to the chronicler Theophanes, Constantine was seized by his mother's supporters in the Hippodrome, where he was attending the horse races. He was brought to the porphyra chamber of the Great Palace, the purple-decorated room where emperors were traditionally born and where Constantine himself had been delivered. And there, on August 15, 797 CE, he was blinded. The blinding of Constantine VI stands as one of the most shocking episodes in Byzantine history. For a mother to order such a punishment for her own son violated fundamental norms of both family relations and political conduct. The fact that the blinding took place in the porphyra chamber, a space associated with imperial birth and legitimacy, added a layer of symbolic horror to the physical act of mutilation. The Byzantine sources are somewhat reticent about the details of the blinding and its aftermath. Some suggest that Constantine died soon after from his injuries, while others indicate that he lived for many years in obscurity. What is clear is that the blinding effectively ended his reign and his public life. Blinding was specifically chosen as a punishment because it rendered the victim ineligible for the imperial office while stopping short of actual execution. With Constantine incapacitated by blindness and isolated from potential supporters, Irene was able to assume full imperial power. She now ruled not as regent for her son, but as emperor in her own right, the first woman to do so in Byzantine history. On her coins and in official documents, she adopted the title Basileus, the masculine form meaning emperor, rather than Basilissa, the feminine form meaning empress. This linguistic choice emphasized that she was claiming the imperial office itself, not merely a female adjunct to male imperial power. The tragic culmination of the relationship between Irene and Constantine raises profound questions about maternal ambition, the nature of power, and the moral boundaries of political conduct. How could a mother bring herself to order such a cruel punishment for her own son? What does this act reveal about the corrupting influence of power and the ruthless political culture of Byzantium? And what psychological scars might have been left by the years of complex power dynamics between a dominant mother and a son struggling to assume his proper place? As we lie here, in the gentle embrace of approaching sleep, we might reflect on the universal themes embedded in this ancient tragedy. The tension between maternal protection and the need for independence, the destructive potential of unchecked ambition, and the terrible choices that power sometimes presents. The story of Irene and Constantine, for all its historical remoteness, touches on human dynamics that remain recognizable across the centuries, speaking to the complexity of family relationships and the moral ambiguities of power. The blinding of Constantine VI by his mother's orders in August 797 CE sent shockwaves through Byzantine society. This act of familial violence violated deeply held cultural norms about the sacred bonds between parent and child and represented an extraordinary disruption of the traditional order of imperial succession. To understand the full significance of this event and its aftermath, we must examine the immediate reactions to Constantine's blinding, the justifications offered for Irene's actions, and the complex process by which Byzantine society adjusted to the unprecedented reality of female imperial rule. The immediate response to Constantine's blinding appears to have been one of shock and horror, even among those who had supported Irene's return to power. Byzantine political culture, for all its acceptance of violence as a tool of statecraft, maintained certain boundaries that Irene's action had transgressed. Theophanes the Confessor, our primary source for these events, describes the blinding as having cast darkness over the inhabited world, a rhetorical flourish that nonetheless captures the sense of moral disorientation that the act provoked. Yet despite this initial horror, there was no significant uprising against Irene's seizure of power. Several factors help to explain this apparent contradiction. First, Constantine VI had alienated key segments of Byzantine society through his religious and political missteps. His divorce and remarriage had outraged the influential monastic community, while his military failures had eroded support among the army. Those who might have been expected to defend the legitimate emperor had already become disillusioned with his rule. Second, Irene had carefully prepared the ground for her coup by cultivating support among court eunuchs, civil officials, and religious leaders who had benefited from her previous periods of rule. These groups saw their interests as better served by Irene's return to power than by the continuation of Constantine's unpredictable governance. The network of patronage and loyalty that Irene had built over years of political maneuvering proved strong enough to sustain her through the moral crisis of her son's blinding. Third, Byzantine society had no established mechanism for removing a ruler who had successfully seized power short of another coup. Once Irene had secured control of the imperial palace, the treasury, and the administrative apparatus of the state, resistance became both difficult and dangerous. The Byzantine political system was designed to concentrate power in the hands of the reigning emperor, or in this case Empress, making organized opposition challenging to mount. Nevertheless, Irene recognized the need to justify her unprecedented position as a female ruler and to mitigate the moral stain of her son's blinding. The official narrative that emerged emphasized Constantine's moral and religious failings, particularly his controversial divorce and remarriage. By positioning herself as a defender of orthodox morality against her son's transgressions, Irene was able to secure support from the monastic community and other religiously conservative elements in Byzantine society. This religious justification was reinforced by Irene's continued support for icon veneration and traditional Orthodox practices. She maintained close relationships with leading figures in the Byzantine Church, particularly in the monastic community, and used her patronage to support religious institutions. Churches and monasteries received lands and privileges, and religious art continued to flourish under imperial sponsorship. These policies helped to solidify Irene's alliance with the Church and to present her rule as aligned with divine will despite its unconventional nature. Irene also took steps to secure her position through more practical means. She rewarded her supporters with offices, titles, and material benefits, creating a network of officials whose fortunes were tied to the continuation of her rule. Particularly important were the eunuchs of the imperial household, who had traditionally served as intermediaries between the women's quarters and the male-dominated spheres of government. Under Irene, eunuchs like the Sacellarios, treasurer, Nicephorus, and the Logothete, finance minister, Aetius, rose to unprecedented heights of power, effectively controlling access to the Empress and many aspects of government administration. The practical challenges of ruling as a woman in a system designed for male leadership required Irene to make certain adaptations. Byzantine imperial ceremonies and administrative procedures had evolved around the assumption of a male emperor, creating potential awkwardness when these roles were filled by a woman. Irene addressed this challenge partly through the adoption of male imperial titles, as evidenced by her coins bearing the inscription Irene Basilius rather than Basilissa, the feminine form. This linguistic choice emphasized that she was claiming the imperial office itself, not merely a female adjunct to male imperial power. Beyond titles, Irene also adopted certain aspects of male imperial presentation. Byzantine emperors were typically depicted in military attire, reflecting their role as commanders of the empire's armies. While Irene did not personally lead troops in battle, her official imagery incorporated elements of imperial military iconography, symbolically asserting her claim to all aspects of imperial authority. At the same time, she maintained distinctively feminine elements in her appearance, creating a novel hybrid of gendered imperial representation. The day-to-day governance of the empire continued largely unchanged under Irene's sole rule. The Byzantine administrative system was sufficiently well established to function regardless of the gender of the person at its apex. The various bureaus and departments of the imperial government, staffed by professional civil servants, continued to collect taxes, administer justice, manage diplomatic relations, and oversee the multitude of other tasks necessary for the functioning of the state. Foreign relations during Irene's sole rule presented both challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, Irene's gender may have diminished her standing in the eyes of foreign rulers accustomed to dealing with male counterparts. On the other hand, her unique position created possibilities for diplomatic approaches that would not have been available to a male ruler, most notably in her relations with Charlemagne. By the late 790s CE, Charlemagne had consolidated his control over much of Western Europe, including the former Lombard kingdom in northern Italy. His expanding power and growing prestige in the Christian world represented both a potential threat and a potential opportunity for Byzantium. The deterioration in Byzantine-Frankish relations that had occurred after Irene broke off Constantine's betrothal to Charlemagne's daughter Rotrud in 788 CE might now be reversed through a bold diplomatic initiative. According to some Byzantine sources, negotiations were initiated in 798 CE for a possible marriage between Irene and Charlemagne, which would have united the Eastern and Western Roman empires. The historical reality of these negotiations remains debated by modern historians. Some view them as a serious diplomatic proposal, while others suggest they may have been merely exploratory discussions or even later fabrications. In any case, they came to nothing, as Irene was deposed before any such alliance could be concluded. The most significant event in Byzantine-Frankish relations during Irene's sole rule occurred on Christmas Day, 800 CE, when Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in Rome. This momentous event, which established a rival imperial authority in the West, was partly justified by the claim that the imperial throne in Constantinople was vacant because a woman could not legitimately hold imperial power. The throne of emperors is held by a woman is something impossible and not approved by the Franks, as some historians have recorded. This Frankish assertion that a woman was incapable of holding imperial authority represented a direct challenge to Irene's legitimacy. The Frankish imperial coronation created a profound challenge to Byzantine imperial ideology, which had maintained that there could be only one Roman Empire and one legitimate emperor. The Byzantine response to Charlemagne's coronation appears to have been muted, perhaps reflecting Irene's precarious domestic position at the time. Rather than directly contesting Charlemagne's imperial title, Byzantine diplomacy seems to have focused on managing the practical implications of this new reality. Within the Byzantine Empire, Irene's sole rule was marked by a relative lack of major military campaigns or territorial expansion. This was partly a reflection of Irene's personal inclinations. She had no military training and showed little interest in leading armies in person, as male emperors were expected to do, but it also reflected a realistic assessment of the empire's capabilities and the benefits of consolidation after the turbulence of the preceding years. The empire's primary external threats during this period came from the Abbasid Caliphate to the east and the Bulgarian Khanate to the north. Irene maintained the defensive posture that had characterized Byzantine strategy for much of the 8th century, focusing on protecting the empire's borders rather than attempting reconquest of lost territories. This defensive orientation allowed for a conservation of resources but may have contributed to a gradual erosion of military readiness and martial spirit within the Byzantine army. In economic matters, Irene's rule saw a continuation of the relatively stable conditions that had characterized the Byzantine Empire during the latter 8th century. The empire's economy remained primarily agricultural, with peasants forming the vast majority of the population and providing the tax base that supported the state. Cities served as administrative centers and markets where the products of the countryside were exchanged. Constantinople, with its estimated population of 300,000 to 400,000, dwarfed all other cities in the empire and indeed in all of Christian Europe. Trade remained vital to the Byzantine economy, though it had contracted somewhat from its peak in the 6th century. Constantinople's strategic location on the Bosporus made it a natural trading hub, and markets in the city offered goods from across the known world. Byzantine gold coins, the solidus numisma, were renowned for their purity and served as an international currency, facilitating commerce throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Irene's fiscal policy appears to have been relatively conservative, maintaining the tax system established by her predecessors while occasionally offering tax reductions to alleviate burdens on the population. Byzantine taxation was sophisticated for its time, with a complex system of assessments based on land ownership, agricultural production, and various other economic activities. The efficiency of this system, administered by a professional bureaucracy, provided the empire with a relatively stable revenue stream despite external challenges. The social impact of Irene's rule is more difficult to assess. As the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, Irene might be seen as a pioneer whose example challenged traditional gender roles and expanded the possibilities for female political agency. However, the exceptional nature of her rule and the specific circumstances that made it possible suggest that it did not represent a broad shift in Byzantine attitudes toward gender and power. Byzantine society remained deeply patriarchal, with clearly defined gender roles that restricted women's participation in public life. Women were generally excluded from formal education, public office, and military service. Their legal rights, while more extensive than in some contemporary societies, were still significantly more limited than those of men. Property laws, inheritance, customs, and marriage arrangements all reflected the assumption of male dominance and female subordination. Within this context, Irene's rule represented a striking anomaly rather than a harbinger of broader social change. Her exceptional position was justified through various rhetorical strategies, including the adoption of male imperial titles and the emphasis on her role as a defender of Orthodox religion. These justifications served to accommodate her rule within existing ideological frameworks rather than to challenge those frameworks directly. The religious dimension of Irene's rule deserves particular attention, as it provided an important source of legitimacy for her unprecedented position. As we have seen, Irene had established herself as a champion of Orthodox icon veneration through the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE. During her sole rule, she maintained this religious policy and her alliance with the monastic community that had supported it. One of Irene's first acts after seizing full power was to address the religious controversy that had emerged from Constantine's divorce. She removed Joseph, the priest who had performed the marriage to Theodote, from his ecclesiastical position and restored full communion with the Studion monks who had protested against the divorce. This action solidified her alliance with the monastic community and reinforced her image as a champion of orthodox religious principles. This religious alliance was particularly important given the challenges to Irene's legitimacy as a female ruler. Byzantine political theory was deeply intertwined with religious concepts, with the emperor traditionally understood as God's viceroy on earth, ruling by divine appointment. The Church's acceptance of Irene's rule, despite its anomalous nature, provided an important theological justification for her position. The support of the monastic community was especially valuable in this regard. Byzantine monasteries were not only centers of religious life but also repositories of cultural authority and networks for the dissemination of ideas. The backing of influential abbots like Theodore of Studion provided Irene with a form of moral authority that helped to sustain her rule despite its constitutional irregularity. However, Irene's reliance on religious legitimation also created potential vulnerabilities. By positioning herself as a defender of orthodox morality, she established a standard against which her own conduct could be judged. The blinding of her son, while rationalized through references to his moral and religious failings, remained a troubling contradiction to Christian ethical principles. This moral ambiguity in the foundation of her rule may have contributed to its ultimate instability. As Irene's sole rule progressed, signs of discontent began to emerge among certain segments of Byzantine society. The lack of major military campaigns may have alienated elements within the army accustomed to the more martial leadership of previous emperors. The concentration of power in the hands of court eunuchs like Aetius and Nicephorus created resentment among other officials who found their advancement blocked by these favorites. Economic factors may also have contributed to growing discontent. While the Byzantine economy remained relatively stable during this period, any failure of harvests or disruption of trade could create hardship for segments of the population. Tax collection, always a source of potential friction between the state and its subjects, may have become more difficult to justify without the traditional justifications of military necessity. By 802 CE, these various sources of discontent had coalesced into an active conspiracy against Irene's rule. The precise motivation of the conspirators remains somewhat obscure, but it appears to have combined genuine concerns about the direction of imperial policy with personal ambition and factional rivalry. The leader of the conspiracy was Nicephorus, the general logothete finance minister, who may have seen an opportunity to seize power for himself amid growing dissatisfaction with Irene's governance. The coup occurred on October 31, 802 CE, and appears to have been relatively bloodless. Irene was seized in the palace and exiled, first to the Prince's Islands in the Sea of Marmara, and later to the island of Lesbos. Nicephorus was proclaimed emperor and quickly secured recognition from the army, the Senate, and the Church. The sticky, relative ease with which the coup was accomplished suggests that Irene's support had significantly eroded by this point, despite her careful cultivation of religious and court allies. Irene's reaction to her deposition, as recorded by Byzantine chroniclers, displays a mixture of resignation and dignity. According to Theophanes, when informed of the conspiracy's success, she asked only to be allowed to reside in the Eleutherio palace, which she had built. Nicephorus is said to have agreed to this request, but then broken his promise, sending her into exile instead. This account, while possibly embellished to enhance the moral contrast between the noble dethroned Empress and her treacherous successor, nonetheless captures something of the personal drama of Irene's fall from power. In exile on Lesbos, Irene was reportedly reduced to spinning wool to support herself, a stark contrast to the imperial splendor she had known. She did not long survive her deposition, dying on August 9, 803 CE, less than a year after losing the throne. Byzantine chroniclers, particularly those sympathetic to her religious policies, portrayed her final days as marked by pious resignation, suggesting a narrative of spiritual redemption that partially offset the moral ambiguity of her political career. The historical significance of Irene's sole rule extends beyond the specific events of her 5-year reign. As the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, she established a precedent that would be followed by later Byzantine empresses like Theodora, wife of Theophilos, and Zoe and Theodora Porphyrogenita in the 11th century. While these later female rulers generally exercised power as regents or co-rulers rather than sole monarchs, Irene's example nonetheless expanded the conceptual possibilities for female political agency within the Byzantine system. More immediately, Irene's rule and its aftermath had significant implications for Byzantine relations with the West. The coronation of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in 800 CE, partly justified by the anomaly of female rule in Constantinople, established a rival imperial authority that would persist for centuries. The concept of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority from east to west, gained credibility from the perception that the Byzantine Empire had deviated from proper imperial succession by accepting female rule. Within Byzantium itself, the memory of Irene's rule became contested territory, subject to different interpretations depending on religious and political perspectives. Iconophile sources tended to emphasize her role in restoring icon veneration through the Second Council of Nicaea, while downplaying or justifying the more morally problematic aspects of her career. Iconoclast sources, by contrast, portrayed her rule as a period of deviation from proper governance, with the blinding of her son as evidence of the moral corruption that accompanied female rule. The Orthodox Church eventually resolved this ambiguity by venerating Irene as a saint, recognizing her contribution to the restoration of icon veneration while implicitly suggesting a narrative of spiritual redemption that transcended her political actions. Her feast day is celebrated on August 9th, the anniversary of her death. This religious commemoration represents a recognition of the genuine importance of her contribution to Orthodox theology and practice, despite the morally ambiguous aspects of her political career. As we reflect on the complex relationship between Irene and Constantine VI, and on the unprecedented period of female rule that followed Constantine's blinding, we are confronted with the limitations of simple moral judgments. The Byzantine world was one in which power and violence, piety and ambition, personal relationships and political necessities were inextricably intertwined. Within this context, both Irene and Constantine navigated paths shaped by the constraints of their positions, the expectations of their society, and their own human weaknesses. Perhaps the most profound lesson of this tragic imperial relationship lies in its illustration of the corrupting potential of absolute power. Both Constantine and Irene, in different ways, fell victim to the temptations of unchecked authority. Constantine in his willingness to set aside his marriage for personal desire, Irene in her ultimate willingness to blind her own son to maintain her grip on power. Their story reminds us that even the most exalted positions cannot exempt us from the moral challenges and personal responsibilities that define our common humanity. As your consciousness drifts toward the gentle embrace of sleep, you might contemplate the enigmatic figure of Irene, mother, Empress, and ultimately Emperor, whose complex legacy continues to challenge our understanding of power, gender, and the moral boundaries of political conduct in the Byzantine world and beyond. The deposition and exile of Empress Irene in October 802 CE marked the end of her remarkable political career, but not the end of her historical significance. In the years and centuries following her rule, her legacy would be interpreted and reinterpreted according to shifting religious, political, and cultural perspectives. To fully understand the impact of Irene's life and reign, we must examine the immediate aftermath of her removal from power, the long-term consequences of her religious and political innovations, and the evolving historical and cultural memory of this extraordinary woman who defied the gendered constraints of her era. The immediate beneficiary of Irene's downfall was Nikephoros, the general logothete, finance minister, who had led the conspiracy against her. Nikephoros moved quickly to consolidate his position, securing recognition from the army, the Senate, and the Church. His swift ascension suggests that Irene's support had significantly eroded by 802 CE, despite her careful cultivation of religious and court allies throughout her reign. Nikephoros, albeit 802-811 CE, represented a return to male imperial rule and to a more traditional approach to governance. Unlike Irene, who had relied heavily on court eunuchs and monastic allies, Nikephoros drew his support primarily from the civil bureaucracy and the army. His background as a financial administrator influenced his approach to imperial policy, which emphasized fiscal discipline and practical statecraft over religious considerations. In religious matters, Nikephoros maintained the official position in favor of icon veneration established at the Second Council of Nicaea, suggesting that Irene's religious settlement had achieved broad acceptance within Byzantine society. However, he adopted a more pragmatic approach to church-state relations, asserting imperial authority over ecclesiastical affairs and occasionally clashing with monastic leaders who had enjoyed privileged status under Irene. This assertion of imperial authority over the church led to conflicts with Patriarch Nikephoros IV, not to be confused with the emperor of the same name, and with Theodore of Studion, the influential abbot who had been an important ally of Irene. Theodore, in particular, developed a critique of imperial interference in church affairs that would have lasting influence on Byzantine political thought, contributing to a more clearly articulated distinction between imperial and ecclesiastical spheres of authority. The most significant challenge to Nikephoros' rule came from external rather than internal threats. In 811 CE, he led a campaign against the Bulgars that ended in disaster. The Byzantine army was ambushed and destroyed by the forces of Khan Krum, and Nikephoros himself was killed in battle, the first Byzantine emperor to die in combat since Valens at Adrianople in 378 CE. The Khan reportedly had Nikephoros' skull lined with silver and used it as a drinking cup, a gruesome testament to the ferocity of Byzantine-Bulgar relations in this period. Nikephoros was succeeded by his son Staurakios, who was severely wounded in the same battle and ruled for only a few months before being deposed in favor of his brother-in-law Michael I Rangabe. Michael's brief reign, 811-813 CE, was marked by further military setbacks against the Bulgars, leading to his overthrow by the general Leo V the Armenian. Leo V, 813-820 CE, is significant for our understanding of Irene's legacy because he revived the iconoclast policies that she had worked to overturn. This second period of iconoclasm, initiated in 815 CE, was motivated partly by military setbacks that were interpreted as divine punishment for the veneration of icons, echoing the reasoning that had led to the original iconoclast policies under Leo III in the 730s CE. However, this second iconoclast period was shorter and less intense than the first. The theological arguments developed at the Second Council of Nicaea had provided a robust defense of icon veneration that continued to persuade many Byzantines despite official policy. Moreover, the experience of the first iconoclast period had led to the development of more sophisticated strategies of resistance among iconophiles, particularly in the monastic community. The second period of iconoclasm ended in 843 CE with the triumph of orthodoxy under Empress Theodora, who, like Irene served as regent for a young son, Michael III. The parallels between Irene and Theodora are striking. Both were empresses who exercised power as regents, both championed the veneration of icons against iconoclast opposition, and both secured the support of the monastic community for their religious policies. These parallels suggest that Irene had established a template for female regency that could be followed by later Byzantine empresses. The final restoration of icon veneration in 843 CE can be seen as the fulfillment of the work that Irene had begun at the Second Council of Nicaea. The Council's theological arguments in favor of icon veneration provided the foundation for this enduring settlement, and Irene's political support for the iconophile position helped to ensure that it would eventually prevail despite the temporary revival of iconoclasm. This religious legacy represents her most significant and lasting contribution to Byzantine history. Beyond the specific issue of icon veneration, Irene's rule had broader implications for the development of Byzantine political culture. Her unprecedented position as a woman ruling in her own right challenged fundamental assumptions about the gendered nature of political authority. While Byzantine society remained deeply patriarchal, the fact that a woman had successfully claimed and exercised imperial power created a precedent that expanded the conceptual possibilities for female political agency. This precedent was reinforced during the Middle Byzantine period by several instances of empresses exercising significant political authority. Empress Theodora's regency for Michael III, 842–856 CE, has already been mentioned. In the 10th century, Empress Helena Lecapene effectively governed alongside her son, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, during the latter part of his reign. Most notably, in the 11th century, sisters Zoe and Theodora Porphyrogenita ruled jointly for a brief period in 1042 CE, and Theodora ruled as sole empress from 1055 to 1056 CE, the second woman after Irene to do so. These later instances of female imperial rule were justified and conceptualized partly through reference to Irene's precedent. Byzantine political theory never fully accommodated the idea of female sovereignty, but the historical reality of Irene's rule created a practical example that later empresses and their supporters could invoke. The fact that Irene had adopted the masculine title Basileus rather than the feminine Basilissa established a linguistic and conceptual framework for understanding female imperial authority within the traditionally male-dominated Byzantine system. Irene's rule also had significant implications for Byzantine relations with the West, particularly through its connection to the coronation of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in 800 CE. As we have seen, this momentous event, which established a rival imperial authority in the West, was partly justified by the claim that the imperial throne in Constantinople was vacant because a woman could not legitimately hold imperial power. The creation of a Western Roman Empire under Charlemagne and his successors created a fundamental challenge to Byzantine imperial ideology, which had maintained that there could be only one Roman Empire and one legitimate emperor. This challenge persisted long after Irene's deposition and death, shaping Byzantine diplomatic relations with Western powers throughout the medieval period. The concept of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority from east to west, gained credibility from the perception that the Byzantine Empire had deviated from proper imperial succession by accepting female rule. In the West, perceptions of Irene were generally negative, influenced by Frankish and later Western European perspectives that emphasized the anomalous nature of female rule and the shocking act of a mother blinding her own son. These negative perceptions were reinforced by the religious differences that developed between Eastern and Western Christianity, with Western sources often portraying Byzantine customs and practices as exotic, decadent, or morally suspect. Within Byzantium itself, the memory of Irene's rule became contested territory, subject to different interpretations depending on religious and political perspectives. Iconophile sources, such as the Chronicles of Theophanes the Confessor, tended to emphasize her role in restoring icon veneration through the Second Council of Nicaea, while downplaying or justifying the more morally problematic aspects of her career. Iconoclast sources, by contrast, portrayed her rule as a period of deviation from proper governance, with the blinding of her son as evidence of the moral corruption that accompanied female rule. The Orthodox Church eventually resolved this ambiguity by venerating Irene as a saint, recognizing her contribution to the restoration of icon veneration, while implicitly suggesting a narrative of spiritual redemption that transcended her political actions. Her feast day is celebrated on August 9th, the anniversary of her death. This religious commemoration represents a recognition of the genuine importance of her contribution to Orthodox theology and practice, despite the morally ambiguous aspects of her political career. The cultural memory of Irene also found expression in Byzantine art, particularly in manuscript illuminations and, later, in church frescoes depicting the Second Council of Nicaea or the triumph of orthodoxy. In these visual representations, Irene is typically portrayed in imperial regalia, often alongside her son Constantine VI before his blinding, or with other defenders of icon veneration. These images help to integrate Irene into the orthodoxy narrative of Byzantine religious history, emphasizing her role as a champion of correct doctrine rather than as a usurper of male imperial prerogatives. Literary representations of Irene in Byzantine texts reveal the complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward her rule. In historical chronicles, she is variously portrayed as a pious defender of orthodoxy, a cunning political manipulator, a loving mother corrupted by ambition, or a ruthless usurper who violated natural and divine law. These differing characterizations reflect not only the varying perspectives of individual authors, but also the broader difficulty of accommodating female rule within Byzantine political and cultural frameworks. The most striking aspect of Irene's portrayal in Byzantine sources is the persistent effort to reconcile her unprecedented political position with established gender norms. Her adoption of the masculine title Basileus represents one approach to this reconciliation, suggesting that she was occupying a formally male role rather than transforming the gendered nature of imperial authority. Similarly, her portrayal as a defender of orthodoxy emphasized a role, the protection of true religion, that was compatible with Byzantine notions of appropriate female action, albeit on an imperial scale. The blinding of Constantine VI remains the most problematic aspect of Irene's legacy, challenging attempts to present her as either a model ruler or a moral exemplar. Byzantine sources struggled to integrate this act of maternal violence into their broader narratives of Irene's life and reign. Some emphasized Constantine's moral and religious failings as justification, while others suggested that Irene had been manipulated by evil advisors. Still others presented the blinding as a tragic but necessary act to prevent greater evils, such as civil war or the return of iconoclasm. The Orthodox Church's veneration of Irene as a saint, despite her role in blinding her son, highlights the priority given to her religious achievements over her political actions. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, sanctity is not necessarily equated with moral perfection throughout one's entire life. The concept of metanoia, repentance, and spiritual transformation allows for the possibility of redemption even after serious moral failings. Irene's pious acceptance of her deposition and exile, as portrayed in sympathetic sources, could be interpreted as evidence of such a spiritual transformation, justifying her eventual recognition as a saint. Beyond the Byzantine world, Irene's legacy has continued to evolve in response to changing cultural and intellectual frameworks. In the medieval West, she was generally viewed negatively as an example of the dangers of female rule and the exotic, morally suspect nature of Byzantine society. During the Renaissance and early modern period, as interest in Byzantine history revived among Western scholars, Irene's rule was often presented as evidence of Eastern decadence and deviation from proper Roman traditions, a narrative that aligned with broader Western European self-definitions against the Oriental other. The development of modern historical scholarship in the 19th and 20th centuries brought more nuanced approaches to Irene's rule, placing it within the broader context of Byzantine political, religious, and cultural history. The emergence of feminist historiography in the latter 20th century generated renewed interest in Irene as a rare example of a woman who exercised significant political power in the pre-modern world, though feminist scholars have grappled with the moral ambiguities of her career and the limitations of viewing her through a contemporary feminist lens. In contemporary popular culture, Irene remains a somewhat obscure figure compared to more widely known